Billy the Kid is one of the most notorious Wild West outlaws in history. That's extra impressive when you consider that he died at just 21 years old. How did he become a legend in such a short time? Here's the sad, true story of Billy the Kid.
What makes you think this story's a sad one?
Historians know very little about the Outlaw's early years. According to the book Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, his mother, Catherine, was an Irish immigrant to New York City. That's where Henry McCarty, better known as Billy the Kid, was born in 1859. No one knows the exact month or day for sure. It's also unknown if his parents were married or if his father was ever in the picture. Billy probably spent the first 6 years of his life in the Irish slums of Manhattan or Brooklyn. The conditions would have been horrific. In the 1860s, when Billy was growing up there, almost 300,000 people lived in 1 square mile. The Irish were only allowed to rent the worst of the worst tenements, and Billy easily could have lived in a 12 by 12 room with 20 other people. Disease was rampant in the slums, and the mortality rate for Irish children was 25%. The fact that Billy made it to 21 could almost be seen as a miracle considering his origins. While his later life would have been characterized by Wild West violence, his childhood would have been marked by the poverty and brutality of New York's ghettos. By the time the Civil War ended, Billy and his mother moved to Indianapolis. She was single by this point and started a relationship with a man named William Antrim. In 1870, the whole group relocated to Wichita, Kansas. It was there that Billy's life took a positive turn. His mother, Catherine, ran her own laundry business, which must have been successful because she was able to purchase land outside of town. Her boyfriend, William, built a cabin and a storm cellar, probably with the help of Billy and his younger brother, Joe. There was every indication that Catherine had put down roots and that Billy would grow up living a happy, secure life surrounded by family.
Wonderful.
But that didn't happen. Unfortunately, Billy was soon dealt a devastating blow. In 1871, Catherine was diagnosed with tuberculosis. At the time, many doctors thought the drier climates could cure a person of TB, so the family packed up their belongings and moved to the New Mexico territory. Billy was only 14 when his mother died of TB. While William officially became their stepfather, he wasn't interested in raising the two boys. He found separate foster homes for the brothers, then abandoned them. At this point, it seems Billy was still a good, law-abiding kid. He found honest work at a hotel where he washed dishes and waited tables. Despite earning a living, he also managed to go to school. But something soon changed in Billy. HistoryNet reports that he first stole some food. Then, a few months later, he was involved in a prank with a friend who stole a bundle of clothes. However, someone turned Billy in for the crime. The sheriff didn't want to do anything more than scare the boy straight when he put Billy in a cell for a couple of days. But Billy took it very seriously. He managed to climb up the chimney and escape. Now he had no family, and in his mind at least, he was a fugitive from the law. Billy was now a teenager living alone in a very dangerous part of the country. Regardless of his age, there were a million ways to die in the West.
Outlaws, angry drunk people, scorned hookers, hungry animals, diseases, major and minor injuries, Indians, the weather. You can get killed just going to the bathroom.
According to Legends of America, 2 years after escaping jail, Billy met a blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill, who liked to pick on the kid. One day, the insults went too far. On August 17, 1877, history reports Cahill called Billy a pimp. Billy responded by calling Cahill a son of a bitch. The blacksmith jumped Billy, threw the teenager to the ground, and pinned him. Panicking, Billy pulled out a gun and shot Cahill. He died the next day. One witness said Billy had no choice but to use self-defense. The kid didn't stick around to make his case. Now he really was a fugitive. Billy joined various gangs and made most of his money through cattle rustling. But one day he stole some horses and was thrown in jail. The horse's owner, an Englishman named John Tunstall, came to see Billy in his cell. After they talked, Tunstall dropped the charges and gave him a job. It was like the family Billy had been missing for so long. Tunstall may have been the closest thing to a father Billy ever had. But Tunstall was involved in an escalating feud over territory. On February 18, 1878, a posse shot and killed Tunstall in cold blood in front of Billy. The story of the kid swearing vengeance over his father figure's grave is a myth, but Billy was now part of a blood feud known as the Lincoln County War. Over the next 5 months, both sides would participate in various shootouts and revenge killings. Billy is credited with a higher body count than he actually had, although he definitely killed at least a few people, including a sheriff. By the end of the war, which his side lost, Billy was known as one of the best gunmen in the West. According to Legends of America, in 1879, New Mexico Territory Governor Lew Wallace heard Billy would be willing to surrender and testify against other outlaws if his charges were dropped. The two eventually met to discuss the situation, and Governor Wallace offered Billy a seemingly straightforward deal.
You testify against everyone involved in this damn war, and I'll pardon you.
The kid agreed to testify. According to their arrangement, Billy would be arrested for show, then spend time in jail until a trial date. Billy's evidence was enough to convict at least one major bad guy, but the district attorney refused to follow Wallace's orders that he be released afterward. So, without a pardon, Billy had no choice but to escape jail once again and continue living on the run. Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, says that the pardon might have meant a chance at legitimate prosperity. Billy was hardly the worst person in the West, but according to the book, the law singled him out for special treatment. Billy should have been a free man at that point. Instead, with outstanding warrants, he returned to what he knew best, a life of crime. He formed his own gang of outlaws and started rustling cattle again. For a year, he lived around Fort Sumner. There, he became friends with a local bartender named Pat Garrett. HistoryNet even reports that it's more than possible Garrett joined Billy and his gang on some of their cattle raids. But the West was often one big gray area when it came to who was a good guy and who was a bad guy. So it wasn't that shocking when Garrett was elected Lincoln County Sheriff. Suddenly, Garrett was in charge of actively tracking down his old friend. It was a complicated pursuit, and numerous people were shot and killed, but not Billy. The sheriff set up many traps and ambushes in an attempt to apprehend Billy, but the kid seemed to have an animal instinct that warned him of danger. That instinct didn't last long. On December 23rd, just days after Governor Wallace put a $500 reward on Billy's head, Garrett and his posse captured the kid alive. Billy took it in stride, telling a reporter from his jail cell, "What's the use of looking on the gloomy side of everything? The laugh's on me this time." By this time, Billy the Kid had become a folk hero to some and an evil outlaw to others. In addition to endless newspaper articles written about him, there were plenty of people on street corners and bar stools sharing tall tales about the kid.
I'll shoot you and kill your people. Boom, 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 boom. And your sheriffs, maybe.
Billy spent months in a Santa Fe jail before his trial began in April 1881. While he'd committed plenty of crimes by then, the charges were for killing Sheriff William Brady during the Lincoln County War. The jury deliberated for exactly 1 day before finding Billy guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, and the execution date was set for May 13th. He had no intention of sticking around for that. Billy was in irons and under constant surveillance by two guards, James Bell and Robert Ollinger, on the second floor of the courthouse. Garrett, who knew the kid's reputation for successful escape attempts, was taking no chances. But somehow Billy got his hands on a gun. Historians have no solid proof, but it's thought either one of his old gang members hid a pistol in a toilet or he took it off of Bell himself. The kid took out Bell first, then grabbed a shotgun and waited at a window for Ollinger, who headed toward the courthouse when he heard the shots. Billy called out, "Hello, Bob," and blasted him. Billy then stole a horse and raced out of town. Against all odds, he escaped custody yet again, but it would be his last time. The next time, Pat Garrett wouldn't take Billy the Kid alive. Garrett later wrote that people were upset he didn't seem to be very concerned about recapturing the kid, but the sheriff said he was, quote, quietly at work, maturing his plans of action. It's almost unbelievable that with his head start and ability to go almost anywhere, Billy never left New Mexico territory. Instead, he returned to Fort Sumner and didn't bother to keep a low profile. Within 3 months, Garrett was on to him. On the night of July 14, 1881, the sheriff and his posse went to rancher Peter Maxwell's house to ask if he knew where the kid was. Maxwell absolutely did. Billy was on his way over with some beef for dinner. Garrett was in Maxwell's dark bedroom talking to him when Billy showed up at the door. Sensing someone else in the room, but unable to see his old acquaintance turned adversary, Billy pulled his gun and asked, "Who's that?" in Spanish. Garrett later wrote about that moment. It was the first time during all Billy's life of peril that he ever lost his presence of mind or failed to shoot first and hesitate afterwards. It would be the mistake that killed him. Garrett let off 2 shots. One of the bullets hit Billy right in the heart. After years of escaping one dangerous situation after the next, Billy the Kid was dead at the age of 21. Billy the Kid barely spent 2 decades on Earth, and he was only famous for a brief period of time. But that didn't stop people from taking his name and image and turning it into whatever they wanted it to be. According to Billy the Kid, The Endless Ride, within a year of his death, dozens of novels and nonfiction accounts very light on facts were published. Even Pat Garrett wrote a biography of Billy. Each subsequent generation used Billy to represent something different. In the 1920s, with the Wild West officially in the past, books presented him as the Robin Hood of a lost pastoral world. Other decades cast him as a frontier superhero, homicidal maniac, or a martyred symbol of freedom. There have been more than a dozen movies and even a ballet devoted to him. Plus, he still makes millions for the tourism industry in New Mexico. However, some people truly refuse to let Billy die because they claim to actually be the outlaw. Vintage News says that one person, Brushy Bill, was taken somewhat seriously. Living in Texas in the 1940s, he managed to convince the locals, some of the kid's contemporaries, and a lawyer that he was in fact the outlaw. Brushy Bill petitioned the governor of New Mexico for a pardon, but the governor was not convinced. Brushy Bill stuck to the story until he died in 1950, and even requested that his tombstone include the line, "AKA Billy the Kid." More than 160 years after Billy the Kid was born, his legend is still going strong, and it shows no signs of slowing down, even if that legend is based on both fact and fiction.
It doesn't matter what's true. It matters the story they tell when you're gone.
The gunfight at the OK Corral is a shootout that has come to represent the glamour and gore that define the Wild West, pitting the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday against the so-called Cochise County Cowboys in Tombstone, Arizona. Here's the messed up truth of the gunfight at the OK Corral. The OK, or Old Kindersley Corral, was a livery business that operated on Tombstone's Fremont Street from 1879 to 1888. Weirdly, the fight itself didn't take place in or next to the corral as its name would suggest. Instead, it happened in a vacant lot next to C.S. Fly's photographic studio and boarding house, 6 doors down from the corral. Doc Holliday, the iconic dentist-turned-tubercular gunman, was a resident of the boarding house. One of the fight's main instigators, Ike Clanton, took cover in the studio while shots were being fired. So did the one man who might have stopped the carnage, the sheriff of Cochise County, John Behan. Incidentally, C.S. Fly's photographs of late 19th century Tombstone have become indispensable to our understanding of life in the Wild West. Fly did not, however, take any pictures of the battle or its aftermath, but he did participate in one way. He disarmed the dying Billy Clanton. Why the shootout became associated with the OK Corral is still a bit of a mystery, but maybe it's because the gunfight in the vacant lot next to C.S. Fly's photography studio and boarding house doesn't quite roll off the tongue. At the time of the fight, Tombstone, Arizona was a powder keg of warring factions and tensions about to explode. It was also a den of iniquity. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, it had 2 dance halls, a dozen gambling parlors, 20 saloons, and, in the words of one resident, quote, 2 Bibles. Tombstone began as a single silver mine. Prospector Ed Schifflin left an Arizona Army post in 1877, hoping to strike it rich in the Dragoon Mountains. His friends warned him that, thanks to the large Apache presence in the area, he was, in effect, digging his own grave. He proved them wrong, though, and discovered a rich silver vein he named Tombstone. A town sprung up around his good fortune, and by 1880, the place was teeming with horses and stagecoaches, with countless other prospectors, sex workers, and aspiring politicians. Saloons and brothels did very good business. So did miners. People continued to pull riches from the ground for 7 straight years until a rising water table put an end to operations. Tombstone survived plenty of booms and busts, and it eventually earned the name The Town Too Tough to Die because it rode out the Great Depression in typical stiff upper lip style. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, and John Henry Doc Holliday have long been cast as the good guys in the shootout, whereas their opponents, the Cochise County Cowboys, have been written off as riffraff. The truth is a lot more complex than that. In fact, the most revered player of all, Wyatt Earp, was a fugitive from the law when he moved to Tombstone, hoping to make his fortune in silver. As a young man, he stole a horse in Indian territory, then he escaped jail and went on the run, moving from town to town and brothel to brothel. The 2 most powerful cowboys, Tom and Frank McLaury, came from Iowa in search of cheap land for their cattle. And they weren't any better or worse than the thousands of other cattle rustlers who moved west in the 1870s and 80s with their eye on manifest destiny. One of the main conflicts between the Earps and the Cowboys was actually pretty mundane. The Cowboys were aligned with Sheriff Behan. Wyatt wanted Behan's job. Meanwhile, Wyatt's brother Virgil, the acting police chief, had spearheaded a campaign to enforce restrictions on firearms. Cowboys liked their guns. Tensions arose as they are wont to do, but there are no villains in this tale, and no heroes either. Just self-interested men bent on amassing power and wealth on the frontier.
You know, Wyatt, you and I are pretty much alike, actually. Both of us live with a gun. The only difference is that badge.
In March 1881, just 7 months before the shootout, Sandy Bob's stagecoach was robbed by a group of masked men. The Earps suspected the McLaury brothers were behind the robbery. The McLaurys were just as convinced it was the Earps, aided and abetted by Doc Holliday. In the meantime, Virgil Earp was busy cutting a deal with Ike Clanton, one of the Cowboys. Virgil, eager to look like a tough lawman in advance of the local elections, agreed to give Ike all the reward money, no questions asked, if Clanton turned in outlaws and suspects. Clanton took the deal, but it was moot. King, Leonard, and Crane all ended up dead before Virgil could capture them. Later, Wyatt Earp, also running for office and knowing Ike Clanton to be of a persuadable nature, approached the cowboy, suggesting they fake a stagecoach robbery. He and Doc Holliday would scare away the so-called robbers, and no one would get hurt. Clanton refused to take part, and bad blood continued to accumulate between the two factions. When, in early October, the Earps arrested Cowboys Frank Stillwell and Pete Spence for robbing a stagecoach out of Bisbee, the Cowboys vowed revenge. They didn't have to wait long. In films and other retellings of the shootout, it's Wyatt Earp who usually gets all the glory. But according to most scholars, the real stand-up guy in this Wild West drama was Virgil Earp. Virgil served as an infantryman in the Union Army in the Civil War before heading west to join his younger brothers, Wyatt and Morgan. He quickly made a reputation for himself as an effective, no-nonsense lawman, earning badges in both Prescott, Arizona and Tombstone. Virgil's goal in Tombstone was to put a halt to the rash of stagecoach robberies that were terrorizing the populace, and his skills as a sharpshooter went a long way toward helping him accomplish his goal. On that fateful day in October 1881, when a bloodbath seemed inevitable, Virgil attempted to get the Cowboys to drop their weapons.
Throw up your hands. I want your guns.
They didn't, of course, and a firefight ensued, with Virgil continuing to unload his gun even as he took a bullet to the leg. No one knows for sure what guns were actually used in the gunfight at the OK Corral, although it's almost certain they were all black powder weapons, the smoke of which would have added to the confusion of an already chaotic scene. Over the years, a number of antique gun dealers have profited handsomely from the sale of guns supposedly deployed at the scene. One Colt 45 single-action revolver, rumored to have belonged to Wyatt Earp, sold at auction for $225,000, and a shotgun reportedly used by Holliday went for $150,000. But the authenticity of those weapons is still up for debate. Lawmen at the time often carried single-action revolvers. Holliday supposedly used a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun given to him by Virgil. The Cowboys all claimed to have been unarmed at the time of the shootout, but with the exceptions of Ike Clanton and Billy Clybourne, who fled the scene, that obviously turned out to be untrue. Frank McLaury and Billy Clanton were found dead at the scene with Colt Frontier revolvers in their hands. Tom McLaury was almost certainly a victim of Holliday's gun. His body was riddled with at least 12 buckshot wounds. So much for Virgil's gun control crusade. As enemies of the Earps, the Cochise County Cowboys have sometimes been portrayed as evil men bent on killing, but for the most part, they were considered by the locals to be more of a nuisance than a group of real villains. The posse, which boasted up to 300 members in its heyday, specialized in cattle rustling and small-time heists. They rode through towns in the Arizona Territory, brandishing their pistols and putting the fear of God into women, children, and preachers. And they became sworn enemies of the Earps, who wanted to bring the so-called Cowboys to heel.
I'll see you soon. I'll see you soon.
A number of petty incidents of horse theft and retribution between the Earps and the Cowboys took place between 1879 and the shootout in 1881, the bulk of which put the McLaurys and Clantons and other Cowboys in a bad light. But Hollywood and historians may have actually gotten it wrong. Ike Clanton, the most demonized figure in the story, ran a lunch counter. And Tom McLaury was unarmed at the time of the shootout. Maybe the Cowboys weren't so dastardly after all. Most versions of the OK Corral story put the blame for the gunfight squarely on the shoulders of cowboy Ike Clanton, who, Wild West lore suggests, repeatedly threatened to kill the Earps for getting in his cattle rustling way. In the days leading up to the shootout, the Cowboys, the Earps, and Doc Holliday were all quite busy drinking and trading barbs and threats, and Clanton was overheard in more than one Tombstone saloon telling patriots that he planned to shoot the Earps as soon as he could get his hands on a weapon. But Clanton was known for talking a big game, and according to his surviving relatives, the Earps and Doc Holliday were the real instigators, robbing stagecoaches and getting away with it, and harassing the Clantons and McLaurys whenever they got a chance. The truth most likely lies somewhere in between. What we know is that after an evening of drinking and bragging, the Earps and Holiday faced off against Clanton and his Cowboys in a historic firefight that killed Ike's brother Billy and stained Ike's reputation forever. He is now often described as a coward and a blowhard because, having boasted about his gunslinging prowess, he fled the scene of battle, later bringing charges against the Earps and Doc Holliday. All four men, incidentally, were acquitted, and Ike Clanton was killed by police in 1887. Wyatt Earp described the Cochise County Cowboys as, quote, lowlives and cow thieves. Regardless, the town mourned Billy Clanton and Tom and Frank McClory in spectacular style, with 2,300 people paying their respects over the course of the day-long memorial. The funeral procession wound for 2 blocks and was comprised of 300 people on foot, 22 carriages, and several men on horseback. A brass band led the way to the cemetery. And the cemetery where the men were buried, Boot Hill, is so called because the people interned there often died with their boots still on.
Well, if you happen to see this gentleman, tell him I'll be waiting for him at Boot Hill. You'll have only one direction to travel from there.
Some tales of the Wild West are greatly exaggerated in their wildness, but in the months leading up to the gunfight at the OK Corral, as well as in the months following, no one was charged with a crime. Masked men robbed stagecoaches and got away with it. Or, in the case of the Outlaws suspected of the Sandy Bob stagecoach robbery, they were killed before they could stand trial. Men simply took justice into their own hands, meaning that after the Earps and Doc Holliday were exonerated for the killings of Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers, Morgan Earp was shot dead in a saloon. Wyatt, vowing vengeance for his brother, assembled a posse and unleashed a vendetta, gunning down Frank Stillwell and his accomplices in cold blood. Newspaper accounts of the gun battle varied greatly, depending on the individual publication's alliances with the fighters. The Tombstone epitaph sided with the Earps, and the Nugget was with the Cowboys. The epitaph's name had many joking that it would be dead within a year, but the newspaper proved to be resilient and relevant, partially because of founder John P. Clum's mission to use its pages to rid Tombstone of corruption, as well as those pesky Cochise Cowboys. Clum wasn't entirely pure in his motives. The epitaph, in addition to aligning itself with the Earps, was also in the pocket of mining interests in the town. The Nugget, in contrast, championed the Cowboys and was, in its coverage of the gunfight, unabashedly biased against Holiday and the Earps.
I guess if you're a sheriff cutting deals with local cattle thieves, it's as well to keep their favorite paper sweet.
In one article about the battle's aftermath, the writer strains credulity with regard to the Clanton boys, stating, "They did not bear the reputation of being of a quarrelsome disposition, but were known as fighting men, and have generally conducted themselves in a quiet and orderly manner when in Tombstone."
You know Wyatt Earp, gambling gunslinger, lawless lawman, and the hero of the OK Corral. But much of his biography was embellished, largely by Earp himself. That means Earp's life story is literally the stuff of Wild West legend. This is the story of his incredible life. Born on March 19, 1848, Wyatt Earp seemed to have 50 different fathers all rolled into one. As author Alan Barra laid out, Wyatt's father, Nick, worked as a farmer, storekeeper, constable, judge, justice of the peace, and law-breaking bootlegger. He also recruited and drilled Union soldiers during the Civil War. A 19th century nomad, Nick dragged the family from city to city for various reasons. By the mid to late 1850s, Wyatt and his brothers James and Virgil had lived in 7 different homes. A 13-year-old Wyatt would attempt his own journey after the Civil War broke out. He detested family work and ran away from home in hopes of fighting like his 2 oldest brothers and half-brother. Wyatt apparently ran into his father at the recruiting office, ending his not-so-great escape from the doldrums of hoeing corn. In late 1869, a 21-year-old Wyatt Earp met Urilla Sutherland. Just after Earp turned 22, they exchanged wedding vows, with Earp's father officiating the ceremony. As detailed in the biography Inventing Wyatt Earp, by 1870, Urilla was pregnant and Earp was constable of Lamar, Missouri, a place that had no jail and where his father worked as a justice of the peace. Whatever hopes Wyatt had for their future died with his wife and child, possibly during labor. It was at that time that Earp embraced his inner outlaw. In 1871, he, John Schoen, and Edward Kennedy allegedly stole 2 horses. However, Schoen's wife claimed that Earp and Kennedy got Schoen drunk to recruit him for the horse heist. She further alleged that they threatened to kill Schoen if he incriminated them in court. Guilty or not, Earp escaped and never faced justice after his arrest. Earp started his law career in Kansas as an accused criminal. After the horse thievery charge, he absconded to Wichita, where his brother James lived. There, Wyatt provided security for saloons and later got hired as a policeman. An intimidating figure, he excelled at pistol whipping criminals and whipping them in fistfights. His cop buddy, Bat Masterson, remarked that there were few men in the West who could whip Earp in a rough-and-tumble fight.
You gonna do something or just stand there and bleed?
Earp got fired for winning one such fight with William Smith, a candidate for marshal who made the grave mistake of insulting the incumbent, aka Earp's boss. The once more unemployed Earp relocated to Dodge City. Per the Dodge City Daily Globe, he worked seasonally as an assistant marshal or deputy for several years, where he maintained order but seemed less concerned about upholding the law. He allowed illegal drinking and prostitution, imposing fines to profit off the crime instead of stopping it outright. Author Lawrence Yadun noted that detractors referred to Wyatt and Bat Masterson as the fighting pimps because of, quote, their affinity for prostitutes and other women of questionable morality. Roger J. observed that in 1872, Wyatt Earp resided at a brothel in Peoria, Illinois. He and his brother Morgan would be arrested there during a February raid. 3 months later, they were arrested at a different brothel, this time at the antiseptic-sounding McClellan Institute. A court might have found Wyatt guilty of pimping because he and Morgan each received hefty fines of $44.55. Later that same year, Wyatt was arrested again, this time on a gunboat said to be occupied by pimps and prostitutes. And once again, he got slapped with a pimp-sized fine.
Goddamn pimps!
Doc Holliday may have been the greatest poster child for those living with tuberculosis. Wyatt Earp said of Holliday, although he sometimes drank 3 quarts of whiskey a day, he was still the most skillful gambler and the nerviest, fastest, deadliest man with a 6-gun I ever saw.
Don't mind if I do.
Kinder words have probably never been said about a dentist, but tales of Holliday's lethal aim were massive exaggerations invented to protect him from robbers and ruffians. He was a thin, sickly man who lost his mother to TB at 15. When he was later diagnosed with the disease himself, the development torpedoed his life as a professional mouth mangler. Instead, he mouthed off at people as a gambler, traveling out west in hopes that the climate would keep his TB at bay. Regardless, the Encyclopedia of the Great Plains claims that Holliday was, quote, not a bluff. The Georgia-born gentleman engaged in duels to protect his honor, and his fighting spirit would lead him to Earp. Sources differ on where the legendary friends first crossed paths. Some say that Holliday became acquainted with Earp in Dodge City, Kansas, while dodging murder charges. Others, like author Chuck Hornung, have asserted that they met in Texas. According to that account, Holliday had beaten a gambler named Henry Kahn with a cane, and Kahn shot him. Looking to recover, he traveled about, encountering Earp in Fort Griffin. In 1879, Wyatt Earp and his brothers Virgil and James arrived in the boomtown of Tombstone, Arizona, later followed by their older brother Morgan and Doc Holliday. Professor Douglas Linder described Tombstone as being, quote, wild even by the standards of the Wild West. It was dubbed the town too tough to die, and according to History.net, it, quote, had no law except that of the gun and knife. Or, as author Frederick Bechtold put it, Tombstone had a man for breakfast every morning. And there were mornings when the number ran as high as half a dozen. When you think about famous Wild West rivalries, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday clashing with the Clantons and McClorys, and Tombstone probably tops the list. But Wyatt Earp was a multitasker where feuds were concerned. In addition to Outlaws, he also fought the law, and one lawman in particular. Johnny Behan had 2 things that Earp wanted badly. Behan was sheriff, and Behan had lived with a woman named Josephine, and Earp wanted both. Earp wooed Josephine, and they would spend the better part of 5 decades together. His bid for sheriff didn't go nearly as well. Some of history's most famous bullets flew during the 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral when brothers Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, along with Doc Holliday, battled Cowboys Billy Clanton and Tom and Frank McClory in an empty lot. 2 other Cowboys, Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, reportedly ran when the shooting began. There were multiple sources of animosity between the groups. For instance, the Cowboys allegedly viewed Virgil, who was a marshal in Tombstone, as an illegitimate lawman because of the dubious way he enforced the law. But the gunfight was also steeped in deep-seated hostility over the Civil War. The OK Corral claimed the lives of the McClory brothers and Billy Clanton. Holliday and the Earps stood trial for murder but were acquitted. However, the bad blood between the Cowboys and the Earps was far from over. Dodge City author Tom Calvin described Wyatt Earp's love life as being pretty complicated. 4 different women identified themselves as his wife over the course of his life, and apparently he never divorced any of them. Then again, writer Roger J. has pointed out that there's no solid proof that he ever actually married most of them either. After his first love, Urilla, next came Sally Heckle, though some evidence suggests her name was Sally Haspel. Regardless, she was a prostitute who got busted alongside Earp on a gunboat. She further complicated things when she identified herself to authorities as Sarah Earp. Wyatt could have actually been her pimp or protector, but whatever the case, they were close enough that Sally likely followed him to Dodge City. Unfortunately for her, Earp fell in love with Maddie Blaylock. As Legends of America detailed, Maddie was a prostitute who became Earp's common-law wife. Sally moved on, and Earp went on to break Maddie's heart by abandoning her for his 4th wife, Josephine aka Johnny Vian's former fiancée. In 1882, Wyatt Earp, his brother Morgan, and Doc Holliday were shooting pool when a different kind of shooting interrupted them. Per history net, 2 bullets were fired. One narrowly missed Wyatt, the other didn't miss Morgan. Believing the Cowboys killed Morgan in retaliation for the OK Corral, Wyatt led a vendetta ride and started executing cowboys. Now a wanted man, he left Arizona and traveled throughout the West, eventually settling in California, where he established himself in West Coast boxing circles. A longtime boxing fan, Earp received training from a pro fighter as a teenager and later refereed fights. In 1896, he was chosen to referee the heavyweight championship bout between Tom Sharkey and Bob Fitzsimmons in San Francisco. Rumors circulated that Earp agreed to hand Sharkey the victory. The fight started bizarrely when Earp entered the ring with a gun under his coat that had to be confiscated. Fitzsimmons bested Sharkey throughout the bout and floored him in the 8th round with a wicked gut punch, but Earp declared it a low blow and disqualified Fitzsimmons. Earp was branded a dirty referee but again dodged a legal bullet. Because boxing was illegal in San Francisco, he couldn't be tried for fight fixing. Wyatt Earp spent the end of the 19th century trying to strike gold. He ran a saloon in Alaska during its gold rush and then rushed to Nevada in 1901 in search of more gold there. He eventually moved to Los Angeles, where he would have a striking influence on the golden age of Hollywood. Earp became an unpaid technical advisor for Hollywood Westerns and befriended 2 of the silent era's biggest stars, William Hart and Tom Mix. Per a Wyatt Earp anthology, Earp and Mix bonded over Shakespeare, and Wyatt compared his life to Hamlet.
Be or not to be? That is the question.
But that's where the similarities ended. According to Earp, that feller Hamlet was a talkative man. He wouldn't have lasted long in Kansas. Earp himself, no speaker of Elizabethan English, might have talked more like the Duke John Wayne. Or rather, John Wayne might have talked like Wyatt Earp. It's been reported that Wayne modeled his on-screen persona after Earp, whom he allegedly got to know personally. The actor was quoted as saying, "Earp was the man who had actually done the things in his life that I was trying to do in a movie. I imitated his walk, I imitated his talk." However, the American Cowboy disputed this narrative, arguing that Wayne instead got his knowledge from director John Ford, who worked with Earp.
We became quite friendly, and I didn't know anything about the OK Corral at the time.
Pop culture often paints Wyatt Earp as a guy who talked sternly and carried a big gun. A very, very big gun.
That's my butt line you're wearing, isn't it?
I guess it is.
Dubbed the Buntline Special, Earp's weapon was said to be one of 5 custom-made Colt revolvers that writer Ned Buntline supposedly bestowed on 5 of the West's greatest gunslingers, all of them lawmen. The long firearms of the law reportedly had 12-inch barrels and the name Ned engraved on their grips. It seems fitting that as an icon of the Wild West, Earp would own the Conestoga of smoke wagons. But was Buntline blowing smoke when he boasted about handing Earp this specially made gun? In 1876, Colt rolled out a line of long revolvers, but no foot-long version existed until 1957, when Colt sought to profit off of Earp's posthumous popularity. Only 30 or so original revolvers existed, and there's no evidence that Ned Buntline ever ordered one.
Annie Oakley was much more than just America's shooting sweetheart. Her life has been dramatized in TV shows and musicals like Annie Gets Your Gun, but this is the real-life story of Annie Oakley. On August 13, 1860, Phoebe Annie Mosey was born to a poor family in a rundown cabin near Greenville, Ohio. When she was only 5 years old, her father, Jacob, died when he was caught in a blizzard on a trip to town. A few years later, Annie's family was close to losing their farm. Thankfully, Annie had learned to hunt and she was able to feed her family. As her shooting skills improved dramatically, she began learning the types of trick shots she'd later become famous for. Annie's hard work paid off. Her skills not only supplied her family with food, but she also earned an income by selling wild game to Greenville merchants. Within 3 years, at the age of 15, she'd made enough money to pay off the family farm. On an 1875 visit to Cincinnati to see her sister, Annie competed in a local shooting match against a professional entertainment and trick shooter, Frank E. Butler. The amused Butler actually chuckled at the sight of the little lady who came up against him and offered to take all bets with a purse of $100.
Gonna be a pleasure to give you a lesson in marksmanship.
Why, you couldn't give me a lesson in long-distance spitting.
But Annie had the last laugh, hitting all 25 clay pigeons as they sailed into the air. Butler hit only 24. Butler was impressed, to say the least. He was also smitten, meeting his match in Annie. He made it his mission to get to know the girl better and wormed his way into her heart. He succeeded, and the couple is believed to have married in Cincinnati on August 23, 1876. The couple began traveling around the West, and Annie Butler adopted a stage name after a Cincinnati neighborhood. As Annie Oakley, she demonstrated her abilities to shoot dimes from a man's hand and cigarettes from his lips, hit the flame on a moving candle, and shoot the middle of the ace of spades over her shoulder using a mirror. She could also shoot targets while standing on the back of a galloping steed. In 1885, William Buffalo Bill Cody offered the Butlers a 3-day trial run with his Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Cody was super impressed and immediately hired the couple. He called Oakley Lil Miss and scheduled her as one of his first acts to get the crowd used to the sound of gunfire. Chief Sitting Bull, a legend immortalized in TV and movies himself, was so impressed with her that he sent her $65 for an autographed photo. Oakley returned the money with the requested photo. Sitting Bull christened her with Tanya Cecilia, which others translated to mean Little Sure Shot. Chief Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's show soon after. Her shooting talents aside, something else made Annie Oakley unique in 19th century America. Knee-length costumes and her chestnut hair flowed down her back, two no-nos for feminine dress of the day. In a thesis entitled Embodying the West, author Julie E. Williams theorized that Oakley got away with her wardrobe because she maintained the lifestyle of, quote, a feminine, domestic, and virtuous woman. Unlike others working for Buffalo Bill who enjoyed a good party, Oakley preferred the comfort of her tent between shows, reading her Bible and sewing. Annie Oakley's career also encouraged more women to participate in sports, a pastime normally dominated by men. In 1898, she brazenly penned a letter to President William McKinley as the Spanish-American War loomed on the horizon. In it, Oakley volunteered her services by offering to personally organize and train 50 female sharpshooters to serve should America officially go to war. Her request was denied, largely because at that time women were not permitted to serve in the military. By 1901, Annie Oakley was at the top of her game. The Wild West show was famous across America, traveling from town to town and giving well-attended performances. But the show came to a stop in North Carolina with a horrific train wreck on the early morning of October 29, 1901. Oakley, who was sleeping when the accident occurred, was violently thrown from her bunk and remained in a coma for 17 hours. When she awoke, her left side was paralyzed. It was only after 5 surgeries, months of recovery, and 2 years that she would walk again. In the aftermath, souvenir hunters would report finding items from the wreck for weeks. Annie Oakley's time with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was done. Needing a less strenuous career, she began giving shooting lessons for exclusive gun clubs. Frank Butler, meanwhile, took a job with the Union Metallic Cartridge Company. The position required giving demonstrations, allowing the couple to continue giving shooting exhibitions to illustrate how great the products were. When World War I broke out, Oakley again tried her luck at offering to give shooting lessons to the troops. She was again denied. The book Women of the American Circus reveals that Oakley took matters into her own hands and traveled across America, giving shooting lessons and demonstrations for the National War Council of the Young Men's Christian Association and the War Camp Community Service. When Annie Oakley died in 1926 at the age of 66, Americans lost their heroine. Fans would never forget the little lady who aimed to please them. Fortunately, 2 films survive in which the famed shooting champion demonstrated her skills. In the years after Oakley's death, movies, songs, and a television show fictionalized her life. The first film of her life, aptly titled Annie Oakley, came out in 1935 and starred Barbara Stanwyck. A 1946 stage musical, Annie Get Your Gun, was made into a 1950 movie starring Betty Hutton and remade in 1957 for TV. Between 1954 and 1957, a television show, also titled Annie Oakley, ran in syndication. But the show was pure fiction, with Oakley and her brother keeping order in the town of Diablo. One thing is for sure, Oakley was a woman who was not afraid to show off her hard-earned skills.
We have ways of taking care of men like him.
She blossomed as a modest symbol of the American female spirit in a time when most women were relegated to careers as housewives and domestic workers. Most importantly, Annie Oakley's endurance and strength in the face of tragedy remains something to be admired, even today.
Everybody's heard of the legendary outlaw Jesse James thanks to the many movies and TV shows dramatizing his life. But how much of the legend is true and how much is nonsense? This is the life and tragic death of Jesse James. The man who had become a fearsome outlaw started out like everyone else, first and foremost as a baby. He was born Jesse Woodson James to the Reverend Robert James, a Baptist minister and successful farmer, and Zerelda Cole James in Kearney, Missouri on September 5, 1847. According to history, Robert died in the fall or winter of 1850 on a trip to preach in the gold fields of California. A widow at the age of 28 with 3 children to feed, Zerelda knew that finding another husband was key to her survival. She married Benjamin Sims in 1852, and after he died just 2 years later, Zerelda married Reuben Samuel in 1855. The world of the James children was rocked by their father's death, their mother's poverty, and her subsequent marriages. Things only got more complicated when, in 1863, a group of Union militiamen converged on the family farm. They were looking for Jesse's brother Frank, who was a member of a Confederate guerrilla gang commonly known as Bushwhackers, which engaged in attacking Union sympathizers as the Civil War raged. Young Jesse was ambushed and whipped by militia soldiers, and Reuben Samuel was hanged from a tree and tortured. Samuel survived, but Jesse became determined to join his brother and fight for the South. Soon after the attack on the family farm, Jesse James joined the war. The National Park Service's documentation of the Civil War confirms Jesse signed up for the Confederate 4th Regiment of the Missouri Infantry. Within a year, he had joined his brother Frank, whose guerrilla gang was headed by William Bloody Bill Anderson. In September of 1864, the Notorious group robbed a Union congressman, James S. Collins, before raiding a Union passenger train. On board were 22 furloughed soldiers who had surrendered, according to history. Anderson's gang ordered the men from the train and mercilessly murdered each of them. The Union's 39th Missouri Volunteer Infantry set out in pursuit of Anderson's gang, but was ambushed at Centralia, Missouri by the guerrillas. Anderson's men killed over 100 soldiers. The bodies of the dead were mutilated, while survivors were brutally tortured. The battle, in which both Frank and Jesse participated, was later called the Centralia Massacre. Jesse was only 16 years old. In May of 1865, Jesse was outside of Lexington, Missouri when he was shot in the chest. His cousin, Zerelda Mim, nursed him back to health, but the atrocities Jesse and Frank committed during the war were considered so terrible the family had to leave Clay County. James's experiences during the Civil War would result in some post-traumatic stress disorder of the worst kind. Unable to return to a normal life, the young man turned to a life of crime instead. According to history, James' first widely publicized bank robbery occurred in 1869 and went terribly wrong. The robbery took place in Gallatin, Missouri, where James thought he recognized the cashier as Samuel Cox, the man who had managed to kill James' army buddy Bloody Bill Anderson in 1864. So James shot him to death. But the cashier was not Cox, rendering his killing even more senseless and brutal. Worse yet, the bounty James snatched up on his way out the door turned out to be a portfolio of bank stationery, not money. As news of James' activities went public, pro-Confederate newspaper editor John Newman Edwards decided to spice up his own paper with the sensational stories about the murderer and would-be bank robber. Edwards published stories portraying Jesse James as a hero who had used his ill-gotten gains to help the poor, while James himself penned letters to the editor defending himself. Readers got their dime novel fodder, while Edwards used the stories to inspire his fellow Confederates to regain political power. America bought the story, although no evidence has ever been uncovered to substantiate Edwards' claims that James was a 19th century Robin Hood. Jesse James would commit more robberies over time. According to PBS, by June of 1871, he had hooked up with the Notorious Younger Brothers gang and robbed another bank in Corydon, Iowa. James discovered that most of the locals were attending a speech by orator Henry Clay Dean at the Methodist Church. After swiping $6,000 from the bank, the gang busted into the church and angrily taunted the crowd with the money. James also started robbing trains and leaving his own press releases at the crime scenes. Many of James' robberies turned violent. At another bank holdup in Kentucky during 1872, the unarmed cashier was shot but refused to open the vault even as he was dying. A more successful robbery, a train at Gads Hill, Missouri, took place in 1874. In between rampages, 3 months after the Gads Hill robbery, Jesse married Zerelda Z. Mims, the cousin who took care of him after he was shot in 1865. After the train robbery, Pinkerton's National Detective Agency was brought in. According to history, the agents snuck up to Zerelda and Reuben Samuel's farm in the dead of night on January 25, 1875, and tossed a bomb into the house. In the resulting explosion, James's 8-year-old half-brother was killed, and his mother lost her arm. Worse yet, the James boys were nowhere near the farm. In March of 1875, a sympathetic group of citizens rallied for an amnesty bill to release the James brothers from all guilt. The bill made it to the General Assembly, but failed to meet the 2/3 majority necessary for the bill to pass. James, who had fled with his family to Tennessee, continued pushing for amnesty. He was likely inspired by the impending birth of his first child, Jesse Edwards James. Just before the baby was born, James wrote a letter to the New York Times, which was reprinted by other newspapers, including the August 5th issue of the Leavenworth Weekly Times in Kansas. In his letter, James claimed that he was a gentleman and that what really incensed him, he said, was that he was being persecuted for the sake of the Confederacy, reproached with horse stealing and burglary by Democratic and Southern newspapers. But the Times came to their own conclusion and disagreed. James had no choice but to remain an outlaw and set about acting like it. A year after his plea for amnesty, Jesse's wife gave birth to a second child, identified by the census records as Ethel Louise James. According to history, just a month later, on September 7, 1876, the James Younger gang, consisting of Frank and Jesse James, Cole, Jim, and Robert Younger, and 3 other gang members, waltzed up to the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota. The men had heard that Union General and Republican Governor of Reconstruction-era Mississippi, Adelbert Ames, had just recently deposited $75,000 with the bank. According to the Grunge Advance newspaper in Red Wing, Minnesota, 3 men went inside and told the cashier to open the safe, which he refused to do, so they killed him. The others remained outside as a lookout, but word quickly got out of the holdup. Angry townsfolk took up arms and approached the robbers in the street. In the ensuing gunfight, 2 members of the gang were killed, while the others fled without any money, but with a few gunshot wounds. The Younger brothers were captured 2 weeks later near Madelia, Minnesota, and were later sentenced to life in prison. The failed robbery was a lesson to Frank and Jesse, who decided to remain in Tennessee under assumed names to avoid capture. After 2 years of living peacefully, however, James decided to resume his life of crime. By the summer of 1879, Frank James had decided to leave his lawless life behind. For Jesse James, however, going straight was not so easy. Riding back to Missouri, he began looking around for a new set of gang members. HistoryNet reports one of them was Ed Miller, Clell Miller's brother. Ed decided to introduce Jesse to the Ford family outside of Richmond. Jesse felt at ease with the Fords, especially Bob and Charlie, who were fellow guerrillas from the Civil War days. The new gang committed at least one robbery in 1879, an express train on the Chicago and Alton Road in October. Soon, however, Jesse was shocked to learn that America was under the impression he had been killed by one George Shepard. An incensed Jesse wrote a letter to the Clipper Herald in Hannibal, from Brownwood, the hardest town in Texas. The letter read, in part, "Your reporter and George Shepard have the most brilliant imaginations in America. I read your reporter's yarn, and myself and my wife laughed heartily over it. The outlaw even teased that he was now living in Brownwood under an assumed name. Tell your reporter to set him up to the boys around and send the bill to me," he wrote. He even enclosed a photograph of himself for all to see, although the paper didn't publish it. HistoryNet says James also remained appreciative of Ed Miller for introducing him to the Fords, at least until the summer of 1880, when Miller announced he wanted to leave the gang. Jesse immediately suspected Miller of betraying him and shot him to death. James next appeared at the Ford house with Miller's horse, which he left there with the explanation that old Ed was on the mend in Hot Springs, Arkansas from some ailment. A member of the Ford family, Jim Cummins, grew suspicious. After looking for Miller for a while, Cummins visited James in Nashville during the winter of 1880-81. As with Miller, James became suspicious of Cummins when he asked too many questions. Cummins took off in the night, fearful that he might too become one of James's victims. As Jesse went after those who he felt might betray him, a whole new set of troubles appeared on his horizon. In 1880, Joseph A. Dawkins published a book titled Life and Adventures of Frank and Jesse James. The book sold like hotcakes, 21,000 copies in 4 months. The book might have spurred both Jesse and Frank to resume their lives of crime with a vengeance. There were more robberies, more killings. But when Jesse again took up his hunt for Jim Cummins and roughed up a 15-year-old member of the Ford family, the Fords had had enough, according to HistoryNet. In the fall of 1881, a meeting was arranged between Bob Ford and Governor Thomas Crittenden, during which Ford agreed to capture Jesse James. Ford would later claim he had agreed to get Jesse, dead or alive. In early March of 1882, Jesse and the Fords began planning several bank robberies in Kansas. Charlie and Bob had moved into the James home, where they awaited their chance to take the outlaw. On the morning of April 3rd, Z was in the kitchen as the men chatted in another room. Jesse had taken off his pistol belt, and he hopped on a chair to dust some pictures on the wall. Behind him, Bob and Charlie quietly drew their guns. Jesse heard a noise behind them and was turning to look around when Bob shot him in the back of the head. Z rushed into the room to see her husband lying on his back. James was not quite gone, trying to say something to Z as she cradled his head and attempted to wipe off the fast-flowing blood, but unable to get out any haunting last words. Within seconds, he was dead.
And that's how I killed Jesse James.
Charlie then explained that the gun went off accidentally. In a 2006 issue of Wild West magazine, Ted Yeatman, long considered the foremost authority on Jesse, wrote that the grieving Z replied, "Yes, I guess it went off on purpose." Jesse James was buried at the family farm as America revered his death. His widow Z was forced to sell everything, including the family dog, to stay afloat. Several historians discovered that in the coming years, Z, her landlord Henrietta Saltzman, James's mother, and even his brother Frank kept the James home as a tourist attraction and charged admission. Because he killed Jesse James rather than apprehending him as agreed, Bob Ford was denied any reward money and even arrested for murder. He was later pardoned and began roaming the country and selling his story, although his actions caused many to believe he was a common coward for shooting James from behind. By 1889, Ford was in Colorado, dealing cards in Old Colorado City and opening a bar in Creede in 1891. Notably, he was turned away from the city limits of Cripple Creek by the sheriff himself in 1891. Despite circulating rumors to the contrary, Ford remained alive until 1894, when one of his enemies, Red Kelly, waltzed into Ford's Creede saloon. Kelly called out, "Hello, Bob," before firing a double-barreled, sawed-off shotgun a mere 5 feet from Ford's throat. Today, the story of Jesse James remains as one of the best-known and most debated tales of the West. However you feel about James and Ford, though, one thing is certain: there are no happy endings for anyone in this story.
The story of HBO's Deadwood has long been one of television's great tragedies because of its untimely end. But with the release of the new Deadwood movie, many fans are revisiting the series and the real history behind it. Here are the true stories behind Deadwood. At a time when most people were hardened by the circumstances of life, Wild Bill Hickok stood out as a unique outlaw. A longtime associate, Captain Jack Crawford, described him as a kind soul, saying, "He was loyal in his friendship, generous to a fault, and invariably espoused the cause of the weaker against the stronger one in a quarrel." Hickok headed to Deadwood in the Dakota Territory in 1876, and in a story that should sound familiar to fans of the show, he did a ton of gambling. He was on a hot streak in one August poker game, but found himself forced to sit with his back to the door. Jack McCall had arguably been humiliated when Hickok returned some of his money and told him to get something to eat.
"You just bought yourself something with that."
McCall had already been drinking, and the perceived insult sent him over the edge. He pulled out a pistol and shot Hickok in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The composition of Hickok's last poker hand has been the subject of debate and myth-making. The story goes that Hickok had been holding a pair of eights and a pair of aces. That configuration has come to be known as the dead man's hand. But is this really what Hickok was holding? According to Arizona historian Marshall Trimble, that story wasn't told until the 1920s. The only contemporary reference to the cards pegs Bill's hand as a king full house. The most likely scenario is that no one checked, and all this stuff was made up later. The name Seth Bullock doesn't carry the same kind of weight as contemporaries like Wyatt Earp. Maybe it should. According to the Theodore Roosevelt Center, Bullock was there for Hickok's death, having arrived just the day before. He'd come from Helena, where he had presided over the first legal hanging in Montana. The scene in Deadwood where Bullock confronts a mob hell-bent on hanging a man is based on what's best described as a true legend. According to the tale told by Kermit Roosevelt in the biography Seth Bullock, Black Hills Lawman, the man who met his maker at the end of that rope was supposed to die at the hands of a hangman. A mob of vigilantes stepped in, and rather than let mob justice get the satisfaction, Bullock held them off with a pistol and did the hangman's job himself.
You called the law in, Sampson. You don't get to call it off just because you're liquored up and popular on payday.
The story is likely Bullock's own invention because newspapers reported that the trouble they expected never came. The hanging was a very public affair, with hundreds of people lining rooftops to get a bird's-eye view of the proceedings. That was against territory law, which stated Bullock's duty was to perform the execution in private with just a few witnesses. The Chinese population on the Deadwood TV series largely kept to itself, not getting up to too much trouble aside from occasionally using pigs to dispose of bodies. But what's the real story? Jerry Bryant, research curator and resident archaeologist of Deadwood's Adams Museum, says the real Deadwood's community of Chinese immigrants lived on a section of Main Street called the Badlands, and many had moved from China to the U.S. in hopes of striking it rich. But when they got there, most weren't allowed to stake mining claims. Even so, Deadwood ended up having a Chinese population of at least 110 people, according to 1880 census records, and about half of Lawrence County's Chinese were in the laundry business. Why laundries? Apparently, it's because they could save the wash water, sluice it, and get gold dust from the miners' clothes. Most of Deadwood's restaurants were also Chinese-owned, and one of Deadwood's major general stores was Phi Li Wong's Wing Su Emporium. Immigration slowed in the early 1880s with the passing of 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act, but Deadwood continued to embrace its Chinese residents, especially a group that organized into a firefighting force.
Switching, woo, hang day.
Woon switching, hang day.
Part of the appeal of Deadwood is its raw portrayal of frontier times, not dressing up the story as some idealized Wild West. That's something you can see in the unglamorous portrayal of alcohol and opium addictions among some of the town's residents. According to the Smithsonian, morphine was a brilliant new cure-all in the 1870s. Doctors administered it for everything from headaches and asthma to stomach pains. At its height, about 1 in 200 Americans were addicted to opiates, an addiction undoubtedly encouraged by the 12.8 million doses of opium pills, powders, and tinctures handed out during the Civil War. Women made up the majority of opium addicts, mostly because it was so regularly used to treat conditions from menstrual cramps to morning sickness. Opium dens popped up across the U.S., particularly in the West, where they tended to be operated by Chinese immigrants. According to the Adams Museum, Deadwood's opium dens were both medicinal and recreational, and by 1882, newspapers were sounding moral alarm bells calling for the end of opium use. It was finally made illegal in 1909. Larger than life and not very nice, Ian McShane's Al Swearingen is a character that seems unlikely to exist outside of fiction. But the real Swearingen was just as bad as the show's version, if not worse. Ellis Alfred Swearingen was born in 1845 and found his way to Deadwood in 1876. By the following April, he'd opened the doors to the Gem Variety Theater. Though the business has been described as being kept neat, tidy, and tasteful, what went on behind the scenes was anything but. Swearingen's so-called painted ladies ran their business out of curtained rooms in the back of the building. By all accounts, beatings from customers, bouncers, and Swearingen himself were routine. By the time it burned down in 1899, papers were calling it the, quote, everlasting shame of Deadwood.
Where's the gym? You'll find it. Everybody does.
They weren't just talking about women luring men away from their homes and into a den of sin either. According to Black Hills Visitor, Swearingen recruited his painted ladies from around the country. He promised to give them respectable jobs working in his hotel or private homes, and it wasn't until they got to Deadwood that they realized the job waiting for them was actually prostitution. Those who refused to take part were thrown out onto the street. In HBO's Deadwood, Trixie is one of Swearingen's girls, and it seems as though she did have a real-life counterpart of sorts. According to Legends of America, flying bullets were the norm at the Gem Variety Theater, and sometimes it was the girls doing the shooting. While details are scarce, there is record of one particular incident involving a gem worker known as Trixie. According to the story, she decided to take matters into her own hands after being badly beaten, shooting her assailant in the forehead. The story goes that he didn't die immediately and the doctor was summoned. But the doctor couldn't do much beyond probe around in the man's head and marvel that he was still alive, until he died about a half hour afterward. History has forgotten the rest of the real Trixie story. Deadwood's Reverend H.W. Smith was a very real person too, and like many who ended up in the real Deadwood, he had a bad end. His might be the most tragic story of all, because by all accounts, he was a very good person trying to do his best to help those in a godless country.
The Lord is our final comfort, but it's a solace having friends.
According to Black Hills Visitor, Smith was the first preacher in the area. The Civil War veteran, doctor, and reverend went to Deadwood in 1876, worked odd jobs during the week to support himself, and preached on Main Street every Sunday. On August 20th, 1876, Smith left Deadwood after pinning this note to his door: "Gone to Crook City to preach, and if God is willing, we'll be back at 3 o'clock." Smith never returned. The Reverend, who wasn't carrying a gun, was killed on the road to Crook City, and on the following day, Bullock wrote a letter to one of Smith's acquaintances detailing the tragedy of his death. No one was ever brought to justice for the crime. Some claim that he had been ambushed by a group of Native Americans or robbers, but another theory suggests he was killed by a group of Deadwood residents who feared having a preacher in their midst would put a damper on their sinful ways. Calamity Jane was also very real, although tracking down the facts is tricky. Biographer and Dakota Wesleyan University professor James D. McLaird says her life was probably not super exciting, summing her up as having a, quote, uneventful daily life interrupted by drinking binges. There are, however, some pretty dark episodes in the life of the woman born Martha Cannery. One happened in Deadwood when a smallpox plague swept through the town. She had already survived smallpox as a child and was immune. Working nurse reported that put her in a position to be a caregiver, and she did exactly that, at a time when being a nurse outside of a convent or other religious institution was bizarrely frowned upon. The illness was deadly, but she saved the lives of 5 of her 8 patients, and was later described by a witness to her work as, quote, a perfect angel sent from heaven.
I'm sorry. I apologize. You got nothing to apologize for. You got a gift for this.
There are less angelic episodes in her life, too. McLaird said she was a dance hall girl for at least some time of her life, and was one of Swearengen's gem girls in the early days of Deadwood. According to the testimony of Deadwood bartenders, she graduated from painted lady to recruiter, sent by Swearingen to neighboring areas to bring back girls for him. On one trip, she was said to have returned to Deadwood with 10 Nebraska girls, tricked into working for Swearingen with stories of wealth and adventure. When news of a massacre reaches HBO's Deadwood, it's the Metz family who has been attacked and killed. One surviving girl is brought back to town. The incident wasn't entirely made up for the show, as there really was a Metz family massacred along the Cheyenne-Black Hills Road. Author and retired National Park Service Superintendent Paul L. Hedren said the 1876 Metz massacre claimed the lives of the entire party, which included Charles Metz, a baker headed to Deadwood, his wife, their cook, and a teamster. As in the show, it was first assumed the attack was the work of Native Americans, but that wasn't the case.
Too much ransacking, and too many goods left behind. Someone was after money.
All the Metz family's gold and cash was gone, and word started circulating that it was the work of a shady character called William F. Persimmon Bill Chambers. Chambers was a well-known killer and horse thief, and the Cheyenne-Black Hills Road was his haunt starting around 1876. Not long after the Metz massacre, another attack put Chambers in the sights of the U.S. Army, and newspaper reports seemed to suggest he was killed sometime in the fall of 1876. The Old West was ripe with hucksters. They tended not to stay in one place for too long for obvious reasons, but history hasn't forgotten all of them. Among the most notorious of the West's con men was Jefferson Randolph Smith, also known to those he associated with as Soapy. One of his earliest cons was charging the public to see his epic discovery of a 10-foot so-called prehistoric man of Creed, which he'd buried in a Colorado town himself. But he was most famous for what was known as his Soap Con.
Soap with a prize inside.
Smith would head into town with bars of soap he'd be selling for $5, about $120 today. Why would anyone pay that much? For a chance at getting the bar of soap that had $100 in it, just like the one the first purchaser, an accomplice, would conveniently find. While it's not clear whether Smith passed through Deadwood before his death at the hands of vigilantes in Skagway, Alaska, there were plenty more just like him who are sure to have walked those streets. Legendary lawman Wyatt Earp was born in 1848. To a great extent, what a man of his day ate depended very much on where he lived. In towns, there was fresh food like baked goods, beef, and lamb, as well as some preserved or dried fruits. Bread was also a staple, whether sourdough or something more elegant. Today, we sometimes refer to the time in which Earp lived as the Wild West. The name is certainly fitting, at least as regards the availability of life's necessities. Things many of us take for granted today either had to be carried from place to place or somehow crafted. This included clothing, replacement parts for wagons, even replacement animals for the teams of oxen that were pulling the wagons. A supply packing list from the era, written by Montana settler James Fergus, illustrates the day's material requirements. In addition to clothing, guns, and ammunition, some of the foodstuffs listed were 600 pounds of flour, 300 pounds of meat, 300 pounds of bacon, and 200 pounds of ham. Beans, dried fruit, coffee, tea, rice, salt, sugar, and specifically raisins were also mentioned. Newly established towns, whether trading posts, mining boomtowns, or cattle hubs, were opportunities for a traveler to resupply. Though some towns thrived, others dried up when the ore ran out, the buffalo were depleted, or a railroad went out of business. Cowboys on trail drive saw their meals improve with the introduction of the chuck wagon with a full-time cook for the trip.
It sort of goes against my grain. Can't get full on fancy. We create food you can eat.
Life in some settlements was primitive, and Wyatt certainly knew this firsthand. He'd driven wagons cross-country, and he'd worked as a buffalo hunter and Army scout. Professional hunters worked as quickly as possible, so fresh meat would have constituted a large part of his diet. Era Army patrols would carry basic food supplies along: bacon, coffee, and hardtack, a kind of dense cracker that traveled well and had practically no taste. What a person might find in town varied greatly. A boomtown might offer only basic food and entertainment. Cattle towns like Dodge City, Kansas, where Wyatt served as a peace officer, had thriving business communities, with shopping and medical services catering to the needs of incoming cowboys. Some of the towns prided themselves on mimicking their big city cousins to the east. One early dining standout was Delmonico's, a steakhouse in New York City. Western eateries tried their best to impress by offering dishes like Eggs Benedict or Baked Alaska. If you could go back to that time, you'd find restaurants all over the West carrying the name Delmonico's, not because there was a chain, but because the New York establishment was associated with sophisticated dining. One such knockoff was located in Tombstone, Arizona territory. By the time Earp arrived in Tombstone in 1879, the town had only existed for a few months. Nevertheless, it was growing in size and cosmopolitan sophistication.
This is so much fun. We haven't been to a show since years.
Wyatt Earp and his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, lived in Tombstone hotels for at least part of their time in town. It's likely that Wyatt, a successful gambler, probably ate out for most of his meals. Tombstone prided itself on offering remarkably diverse fare. Cowboy Ike Clanton even dabbled in the restaurant business for a time, opening an eatery of his own in 1878 in nearby Tombstone Mills. Most of Tombstone's cafes and restaurants had sophisticated cuisine, often dismissing regional ethnic fare as peasant food, though it was usually still available. Tombstone's Grand Hotel, for instance, offered such delights as salmon, gumbo, and various fruit pies for dessert. Wyatt could have enjoyed a fresh steak most any time, but Tombstone also offered up such delicacies as oysters shipped in from the coast. There was also Chinese, French, and Italian restaurants, and home cooking spots for simpler meals. There was also an abundance of saloons, of course, though Wyatt didn't drink. We do know for certain that he enjoyed one treat regularly: ice cream. Earp made frequent stops at Tombstone's ice cream parlor, the Ice Cream Saloon. In fact, the Earps and their friend Doc Holliday would have passed it on their way to their legendary gunfight near the OK Corral. Thanks in no small part to his enduring pop culture value and the way that cowboy guns look super cool, Wyatt Earp's legacy as a lawman and stone-cold pistol-whipping American badass continues to live on nearly a century after his death. But how did the life of the gambler, gunfighter, and legend in his own time, Wyatt Earp, come to a close? Chronic cystitis, or for the layman, a nasty UTI. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Wyatt Earp was born March 19, 1848 in Monmouth, Illinois, and relocated with his family a year later to Pella, Iowa. At 13, he reportedly tried on multiple occasions to run away from home and enlist in the Union Army, but his father always found him and put him back to work on the family farm.
I'm going to enlist, Pa. I want to fight the Rebs with James and Verge. I'm ready.
Are you?
Earp would spend the majority of his adult life on the move, going from town to town across the United States working in a variety of fields, including hauling freight and grading rail for the Union Pacific Railroad. His first recorded job in law enforcement came when his father resigned as the constable of Lamar, Missouri, and Earp was appointed as his replacement. Contrary to the image portrayed in popular culture, Earp wasn't always a force for law and order. After the death of his wife in 1870, he was accused of failing to turn in funds collected for the local school board, then arrested on charges of horse theft. Instead of standing trial, he climbed through the open roof of his jail cell and booked it for Peoria. Earp's life was intensely multifaceted, and it would take hours to get into the full details of his work as a brothel bouncer, silver miner, card dealer, and, if the movies are to be believed, a lawman who had quite a way with words.
Your friends might get me in a rush, but not before I make your head into a canoe, you understand me?
Today, he's best known for his involvement in the gunfight at the OK Corral and the ensuing violence that was part gang war, part vendetta ride. The shootout and the events surrounding it are still remembered to this day, an oversimplified tale of good versus evil, right versus wrong, and a grim reminder that Kevin Costner had a really difficult time making a good movie there for a while. Wyatt was the last participant of the gunfight at the OK Corral still standing when he finally passed away in 1929. At 80 years old, he had a good run, especially considering how much of his life was spent with bullets flying around his person, and had survived what was arguably a more dangerous situation than any shootout: his involvement in a professional sports scandal. In 1896, Earp refereed a boxing championship between two of the preeminent fighters in the world, Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey. Earp called the fight for Sharkey after announcing a blow below the belt that nobody in the audience seemed to witness. In the ensuing court cases, a conspiracy to rig the fight was revealed, and Earp became synonymous across the United States with corruption. He held on to his reputation as a crooked referee long after his death. Helped in large part by the publication of an aggrandizing biography and the birth of Western feature films, Earp started to redefine himself as Old West royalty. Even with all of this, when he passed away from a urinary tract infection in 1929, he was still considered by many to be less of a frontier hero and more of a punk who ruined a lot of people's Wednesday nights when he messed up the bets they had on whatever the 19th century equivalent to pay-per-view was. In the end, what can be learned from the life and death of Wyatt Earp? That's a complicated question, but here's one takeaway. Encourage your grandparents to make an appointment with their urologist before it's too late, because UTIs are astonishingly common during old age and, if left unchecked, can lead to life-threatening infections.
That's a promise.
The American frontier of the late 1800s is called the Wild West for a reason, and the women of the Wild West were often just as unruly and bold and fearless as their more famous male counterparts. Here's the truth about the Wild West's female outlaws. Beautiful, refined, intelligent, Etta Place was a triple threat when she met Harry Longabaugh and Robert Leroy Parker, the outlaws known as the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy respectively, at a San Antonio brothel around 1900. Sadly, many of the details of Place's life have been lost to time. Some historians suggest Place and another famous lady linked to Longabaugh and Parker, Ann Bassett, might have been one and the same person. Much of what's been written about her is conjecture and hearsay. Rumor was she often held the getaway horses while Longabaugh and Parker robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches. She might even have fended off an entire posse on her own. What is known, though, according to the book Red Light Women of the Rocky Mountains, is Place became not only Longabaugh's companion and lover, but also an accomplice to his and Parker's life of crime. Shortly after meeting the two men, she fled with them to Argentina and even participated in a bank robbery there. Legend has it that Longabaugh and Parker were eventually shot dead by the Bolivian cavalry. It's possible that Place, too, was killed in the same operation. Either that, or she returned to the American West to work as a sex worker until her death, or a teacher, or a soldier in the Mexican-American War. Either way, props to the outlaw queen. Don't let the facial hair fool you. Eleanor Dumont was, in her early years as a blackjack dealer in mid-1800s San Francisco, as feminine as they came. Dumont dressed well and kept her hair piled high. Born in New Orleans in 1828, she moved to California when she was 21 and quickly earned a reputation as a crafty card player, perhaps too crafty. She was eventually fired from the Bella Union Saloon on suspicion of card sharping. Basically, she cheated at cards. No matter, Dumont had a bunch of cash with her when she skipped town for Nevada City. There, she opened up her own saloon, Vantion, named for her favorite game. Soon, minors were flocking to her tables, and they did their best to seduce her, too. Dumont, though, would not be one, not until she left Nevada City for Carson City, where she purchased a ranch and fell in love with a man named Jack McKnight. But McKnight was a swindler. He sold the ranch and pocketed the profits. So Dumont shot him dead. Dumont's later life is a sad study of gradual decline. Having grown a pronounced line of hair on her upper lip, she suffered the indignity of being nicknamed Madam Mustache. Worse yet, her card-playing abilities deserted her. One night in 1879, she took a bottle of red wine and a dose of morphine and walked alone out of town. She was found dead the next morning. Mary Catherine Horney was often called Mrs. Doc Holliday because of her long-standing relationship with the dentist-turned-gunslinger, but she was much more than just outlaw arm candy. She was a force all her own.
A sweet
soft Hungarian devil.
Horny was born in 1850 in what was then the Kingdom of Hungary. However, her family moved to Mexico, where Horny's father served as the personal surgeon to Emperor Maximilian. When the emperor's government collapsed, the Hornys packed up and moved to Iowa. Soon, Kate was orphaned, and then after losing her husband and son to yellow fever, ended up as a sex worker in Dodge City. That's where she met Wyatt Earp, who in 1875 introduced her to Doc Holliday. She and Holliday fell head over heels in love. Such was Horny's devotion that when Holliday was arrested for stabbing a man over a card game, she set fire to a shed to create a distraction. Then she threatened to shoot Holliday's jailer if he didn't free him. Spoiler alert, Holliday was set free. The pair eventually ended up in Tombstone, where Holliday took part in the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral. Horny wasn't in Tombstone at the time. Holliday, concerned about her safety, sent her away, and their love affair petered out. Horny died at age 89 in the Arizona Pioneer home. Pearl Hart, nicknamed the Arizona Bandit, robbed stagecoaches the way some people write emails, like it was her job. And really, it was her job. Starting in May of 1899, desperate for some money to send home to her young son, Hart and her lover Joe Boot decided to hold up the Globe to Florence coach. Hart, dressed as a man, walked away from the robbery with $418 in cash. It would have been $421, but Hart felt bad for the passengers and gave each of them $1 so they could purchase something to eat in town. The law caught up with both Hart and Boot, and they were sent to jail. Hart then charmed some guards into helping her escape, but she was caught soon afterward. Boot was sentenced to 30 years. Hart, though, was acquitted. This infuriated the judge, who sentenced her to 7 years for stealing the stagecoach driver's pistol. Then, awkwardly enough, Hart got pregnant in prison, and as a way to save face, the governor of Arizona pardoned her in 1902. Her life afterwards is hard to pin down. Some say she became an actress, others a player in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Still, others say she settled down with rancher Calvin Bywater and became, in the words of her neighbors, soft-spoken, kind, and a good citizen in all respects. Before Sally Skull became one of the most feared wives on the frontier, she was simply Sally Newman, born in 1817 in Illinois. 6 years later, her family moved to Texas, where Sally got her first taste of just how brutal life in the Wild West could be. She once watched impressed as her mother chopped off the toes of a Native American man who'd slid his foot under their cabin door. Young Sally would go on to shame a neighbor for not confronting another native intruder, demanding he give her his gun. If he couldn't deal with the intruder, she would do it herself. In 1833, after witnessing his heroics in a war with local tribes, Sally married Jesse Robinson. Robinson got out alive after 10 years of marriage. Her next 3 husbands, George Skull, John Doyle, and Isaiah Watkins, were not so lucky. All died under mysterious circumstances. Skull became so famous for her dead mates that mothers often used her as a threat to rein in their naughty children, saying, "You better be good or Sally's skull will get you." No one knows exactly how Skull died, although legend has it her 5th and final husband killed her for her money and buried her in a shallow grave. Others say she moved to El Paso and spent her last years writing her life story. Belle Starr didn't seem destined to be an outlaw. She was born Myra Maybelle Shirley in Carthage, Missouri, to wealthy parents and what seemed like a prosperous future. But then the Civil War wiped out her family's fortune and they moved to Texas to start over. Belle, who'd worked as a scout and spy for the Confederacy during the war, soon took up with the wrong crowd, the James Younger gang to be exact. Not to mention that she began associating with the criminal Jim Reed, who would eventually become her husband. Reed was an inveterate horse thief and bank robber. He dragged Belle all over Texas, California, and the Indian Territories, evading the law, murdering men, and in general getting into trouble. As a young mom, Belle aided and abetted her husband, but there's little proof that she actively participated in his crimes. It wasn't until Reed's death in 1874, when she took up with Sam Starr, a part Cherokee outlaw, that her life as the bandit queen truly began.
Now I'll tell you who I am. My name is Belle Starr.
She and Sam claimed a 1,000-acre ranch in Oklahoma and often played host to Jesse James and other wanted men. She stole horses, ran liquor, and spent a short time in jail for horse theft and bootlegging. In 1886, Sam Starr was killed by a rival, and Belle lost her taste for crime and went straight. But someone apparently held a grudge. In January 1889, she was ambushed and murdered by unknown assailants. Pearl DeVere got her start as a sporting woman in the late 1870s. Born in Chicago and raised in Indiana, she moved west to make a buck off the back of lonely men. DeVere arrived in Denver under the guise of one Mrs. Isabel Martin. Denver treated DeVere well until the Silver Panic of 1893, when she decided to take her chances on the boomtown of Cripple Creek. She set up her own brothel in the town's red light district and soon began doing very good business. Catering to Cripple Creek's well-to-do, she made sure the young women in her employ were healthy and looked after. DeVere's family back in Indiana believed she was working not as a madam, but as a dressmaker, and she did try to attain at least a level of respectability, marrying a mill owner, C.B. Flynn, in 1895. But when a fire swept through town, taking her brothel and his mill with it, the marriage effectively dissolved. Flynn moved to Mexico. DeVere remained in Cripple Creek and opened up another entertainment establishment, one she called the Old Homestead. After a fabulously decadent party in June 1897, DeVere retired to her room, and finding she couldn't sleep, took some laudanum. She was found dead the next day. Rose Dunn was born to a family of ne'er-do-wells. Dunn's brothers introduced her to the Dalton Gang, a crime syndicate operating in Kansas in the early 1890s, and to George Bitter Creek Newcomb, thereby sealing Dunn's fate. She fell in love with Newcomb, who later joined the Dalton Gang, and soon she was up to her petticoats in crime and intrigue. It was actually Newcomb who gave Dunn her nickname. He called her the Rose of Cimarron in homage to her beauty and grace under pressure, and she earned it. Everything came to a head on the afternoon of September 1st, 1893, when the Dalton Gang pulled up in a saloon, engaged in a gunfight with U.S. Marshals in Ingalls, Oklahoma. Dunn reportedly ran through a hail of bullets to deliver a Winchester rifle to Newcomb, lying prone on the ground. Some reports suggest she fired a number of shots before handing Newcomb the gun. Can you say relationship goals? 2 years later, Dunn's brothers sold Newcomb out to authorities, and the outlaw was killed. Eventually, Dunn went on to marry a respected Oklahoma politician. She lived the rest of her life in mundane respectability. Like Etta Place, Laura Bullion found herself at the center of some of the Wild Bunch's most nefarious deeds. Born to outlaw Harry Bullion, she began her life of crime at 13 years old when she first met Ben Kilpatrick, the tall Texan, and William Carver of Butch Cassidy and Sundance's lawless gang. She was welcomed into the bunch with open arms, forging signatures and taking part in robberies, and the members dubbed her the Rose of the Wild Bunch. Soon after the gang robbed the Great Northern Train in July 1901, making off with $60,000, Bullion was arrested with $8,500 worth of banknotes on her person. She served 2.5 years in prison. The arresting officer who apprehended Bullion noted she was cool and shows absolutely no fear. She later moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and lived under an assumed name as a seamstress and housekeeper until her death at age 85. As Wyatt Earp's common-law wife, Josephine Sadie Marcus was witness to history and often helped make it. Marcus was a rebel from a very young age. At age 17, if her accounts of her youth can be believed, she ran away from home to join a theater troupe. Then, defying her parents' wishes yet again, she moved to Tombstone, Arizona to be closer to her sweetheart, divorced ladies' man John Behan. It was in Tombstone that Marcus met Wyatt Earp, who was likewise attached. Love like theirs could not be stopped by anything as inconvenient as having other partners, and the two were romantically linked by the time the gunfight at the OK Corral threw Tombstone into chaos on the afternoon of October 26, 1881.
Oh my God.
Marcus stood by her man as he visited vengeance on the men he blamed for killing his brother Morgan. Marcus's biographer describes her as an unforgettable beauty, a cross between Dolly Parton and Penelope Cruz. Earp, who had been known for his wandering eye, remained with her for almost 50 years until his death in 1929. Lillian Frances Smith was most known for being a rival of Annie Oakley in Buffalo Bill's Wild West traveling show, but like so many rebellious frontier women, she was not defined simply by the famous people who surrounded her, or indeed by the men who tried to capitalize on her talent. Smith got into sharpshooting thanks in part to her controlling and mercenary father. He saw the potential to make money off his daughter's uncanny knack for shooting glass balls out of the air, and soon Smith was on the road, entertaining audiences not just with her gunplay, but with a fake Native American persona. She joined Wild Bill Cody's troupe at age 14, and a few years later started calling herself Winona and passing as a so-called Indian princess. Smith, who threw herself into the offensive role of a flirty and brash Indian with a drinking problem, was the foil to the more Victorian and proper Oakley. Smith was eventually forced out of the show, probably by a jealous Oakley, and she began touring on her own, falling in and out of love with different men and taking her Indian princess act to Hawaii, the East Coast, and the World's Fair. When she died in 1930 at the age of 59, she was buried in full suit garb.
Since the early 1900s, Hollywood has brought many different versions of Wyatt Earp's life to film. And while not all of these portrayals are performances for the ages, we're always happy to see an Earp on screen. Here are the best portrayals of Wyatt Earp on screen, ranked from worst to best. In 2017, Alex Cox, writer and director of cult classics such as Sid and Nancy and Repo Man, released Tombstone Rashomon, a bizarre sci-fi western about a group of filmmakers who somehow travel back in time and end up at the OK Corral after the infamous shootout. Cox borrowed from Akira Kurosawa's 1950 classic Rashomon, in that the survivors of the gunfight each tell a different version of what happened to the film crew. Cox attempted to pay for his vision through crowdfunding platform Indiegogo.
My name is Wyatt Earp. My present profession is saloon keeper.
While HuffPost asked about his inspiration for the movie, Cox said, "Oh, I don't really know. I've been thinking about doing the OK Corral story for a very long time. I guess it came as a result of seeing Rashomon. Such a good film and such a good way of approaching a story of which there's more than one version. It just seems appropriate." But then you get into a situation where you're trying to raise money for a film called Tombstone Rashomon from the general public. How many people know what Rashomon is? 1 in 1,000, maybe? The film received tepid reviews from the few critics who knew of its existence. Adam Newbury played Wyatt Earp, a performance that took a back seat to the zaniness of the plot, and ends up as the worst and weirdest portrayal on screen of the iconic lawman. This is Val Kilmer's second appearance in a Wyatt Earp film, and this time he's playing the Old West legend himself. The direct-to-video Wyatt Earp's Revenge goes back and forth between Wyatt as an older man, played by Kilmer, and as a younger man, played by Sean Roberts. While in San Francisco, Wyatt tells a reporter a very vivid and very historically inaccurate tale about how he and his posse of men went after Spike Kennedy, the killer of his lover, Dora Hand. Some critics refer to Kilmer's performance of an aging Wyatt as tired. This was surprisingly one of the better reviews of the movie, and Roberts' younger version of Wyatt is played with one single expression of his face throughout most of the film. One of the highlight performances is that of Wilson Bethel as a young Doc Holliday, whose take on the character is very maniacal to say the least. Wichita is director Jacques Tourneur's retelling of the early, pre-Dodge City part of Wyatt Earp's career. The film was notable for being Allied artists' first release in CinemaScope and a prequel to John Ford's My Darling Clementine. According to Great Western Movies, actor Joel McCrea was more popular than John Wayne at the time of filming.
My name's Earp. Wyatt Earp.
In Wichita, McCrea plays a stern young Wyatt Earp. Some criticize the casting of McCrea because in real life the actor was 50 years old at the time of filming, and Wyatt was much younger while working as a policeman in Wichita. Many consider Hour of the Gun to be director John Sturges' best movie. James Garner plays Wyatt Earp, and Jason Robards plays Doc Holliday in the sequel to Gunfight at the OK Corral. Hour of the Gun goes into the little-discussed third act of Wyatt's life, showing the paranoia and moral decline of the lawman. The film was ahead of its time and took many risks when it came to its plot and climax, which led to poor reception during its initial release, but much more relevance and appreciation many years later. According to TCM, the proffering of a fallen king, a hero weakened and ultimately destroyed by desire and revenge, was unprecedented in the 60s Western film genre. AMC notes that Garner would later portray Earp again in 1988, this time in the TV movie Sunset. Stuart Lake sold the rights to his book, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, to the Fox Film Company for $7,500 and loyally split $6,750 with Wyatt's wife, Josephine Marcus, according to History.net. Frontier Marshal was the first movie based on Lake's famous biography that made Wyatt into an American hero. The protagonist, played by George O'Brien, is based on Earp, but uses the name Michael Wyatt. O'Brien would later work closely with director John Ford in many movies and became a Navy captain during World War II. John Ford would eventually make the Wyatt Earp film My Darling Clementine in 1946, which was based upon the second adaptation of Frontier Marshal. An even earlier portrayal of Wyatt on the big screen was Burt Lindley, during a very brief scene in the 1923 silent movie Wild Bill Hickok. While Frontier Marshal isn't the best portrayal of Wyatt on screen, it was the first to give him significant on-screen time, and credit to his name as the legendary lawman of the Wild West. Released in 1939, Frontier Marshal was the second version of the film of the same name released in 1934. It was also the first movie centered on the life of Wyatt to use his real name. Wyatt was portrayed by actor Randolph Scott.
You're under arrest. Put down those guns.
According to Great Western Movies, Scott plays a strong, clean-cut Wyatt Earp who never makes a move on his love interest Sarah, played by Nancy Gates. Frontier Marshal would later serve as the basis of John Ford's 1946 remake My Darling Clementine. The film was known for its ensemble cast and acting that dazzled viewers. Cesar Romero also enchants with his dark portrayal of Doc Holliday. Released in 1971, Doc is a very unique addition to the film renditions of Wyatt Earp because it made a statement about the Vietnam War's impact on America. Screenwriter Pete Hamill made this apparent connection explicit, saying, "We were continuing to fight in Vietnam because of some peculiar notions of national macho pride. Indochina was Dodge City, and the Americans were some collective version of Wyatt Earp." As HistoryNet notes, the film was known for being one of the dirty westerns popular in the early 1970s for presenting a crude, realistic portrayal with dirty, weathered sets and costumes. The film was also noted for its revisionism, rewriting the characters fans were used to seeing in previous Wyatt Earp movies. Paul Mavis of DVD Talk described Harris Yulin's version of Wyatt as a cold-blooded Nixonian politician who doles out smarmy, unconvincing platitudes about making Tombstone a better place to live for families, all the while plotting and scheming to take over the town and bleed it dry. Gunfight at the OK Corral was John Sturges' first feature film based on Wyatt Earp. Legendary actors Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas star as Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. According to the Mark C. Carnes book, Past Imperfect, History According to the Movies, the film focused more on the psychology of the relationship between Doc and Earp, and stayed closer to historical fact than previous Wyatt screen adaptations. AMC notes that while the cast was brilliant, the movie's true star will always be the tour de force shootout that gives the movie its name. The elaborately staged scene took a reported 44 hours to film for a mere 6 minutes of screen time. Lancaster's portrayal of Wyatt is considered by some critics as underplayed and reactionary to his supporting cast. When it comes to Kirk Douglas playing Doc Holliday, John G. Nettles of Pop Matters writes, "Douglas, on the other hand, is clearly having fun, even if no one else is. The flamboyant Doc Holliday is the Hamlet of the Western, a role with so many layers and shades that whoever plays it inevitably dominates the film." The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp was the first adult Western on television and became a top 10 rated series, reports the Los Angeles Times. Actor Hugh O'Brian became a household name and earned Emmy nominations for his portrayal of the OK Corral icon. The series followed Wyatt from the first episode, where he becomes Marshal of Ellsworth, Kansas, to later episodes where the lawman moves to Dodge City. Actor Hugh O'Brian took the role seriously and spent lots of time developing the character of Wyatt for the ABC series. One of his most proud achievements as Wyatt was developing the fast draw the lawman was known for.
It's important to draw fast and get off the first shot, but it's much more important to have your bullet go where you want it to go.
The actor told the Archive of American Television in 2005, "I didn't want to force them into having to cut away whenever that happened. I wanted it to be realistic." Kevin Costner stars as Wyatt Earp in a 3-hour-plus biographical film that aims to cover the entirety of Wyatt's life. According to the Morning Call, Costner had approached director Lawrence Kasdan about making a miniseries on Earp. Kasdan turned down the idea of a miniseries and opted to make a full-length film about the Wild West lawman instead. Kasdan explained the significance of Costner's performance, saying, "To me, great acting is the closest you can get to the truth of the moment. And I don't think there's anyone in the world who understands how to act for a camera better than Kevin Costner does." Wyatt Earp is a major piece of acting from Costner. He goes from real youth and innocence to a tragically earned wisdom. He plays it perfectly, calibrates it just so, and never once begs for your sympathy. The film was more historically accurate than most others based on Wyatt Earp. According to Mark C. Carnes in Past Imperfect, History According to the Movies, Kevin Costner claimed his version of Earp was constructed, quote, "within the bounds of historical fact." However, many critics complained that the film focused too much on retelling the accuracy of Wyatt's life and not about what made him so iconic. Stephen Hunter of the Baltimore Sun said the film was, quote, a myth in search of a man. When comparing 1993's Tombstone to 1994's Wyatt Earp, more Western fans and critics have chosen Tombstone as the better film. It was indeed a gunslinging showdown between both movies, with Tombstone also winning at the box office by earning $56 million, more than double Wyatt Earp's earnings. Tombstone focused on more than just Wyatt Earp's character, and the film wasn't afraid to take artistic liberties that weren't too distracting from a realistic portrayal of Wyatt Earp. The film contained an ensemble cast, with Val Kilmer's iconic part as Doc Holliday at the center.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish.
Kurt Russell put a lot of work into the character of Wyatt, and even more behind the camera. Kilmer told The Hollywood Reporter, "I have such admiration for Kurt, as he basically sacrificed lots of energy that would have gone into his role to save the film. Everyone cared, don't get me wrong, but Kurt put his money where his mouth was. I watched Kurt sacrifice his own role and energy to devote himself as a storyteller, even going so far as to draw up shot lists to help our replacement director, George Cosmatos, who came in with only 2 days prep." My Darling Clementine is one of director John Ford's best films, focusing on Wyatt Earp as he helped restore law and order by bringing civilization to the Wild West. According to Britannica, My Darling Clementine was one of the first movies to elevate Wyatt Earp to mythical status and helped establish the legend of the gunfight at the OK Corral. The screenplay may have been historically inaccurate, but audiences were treated to a masterclass in directing by Ford and a cinematic experience that painted a close enough picture of the real Wyatt Earp. TCM notes that Ford concentrated on the smaller, mundane moments of Earp's life, such as his visits to the barber or his attraction to the new woman in town. This use of filmmaking also explains why Criterion selected the shot of Wyatt casually leaning back on his chair, overseeing the town in a subtle and very concentrated way for its cover. Last but not least, Ford does the iconic shootout at the OK Corral just right. These are the reasons why we had to go with My Darling Clementine as the best film portrayal ever of Wyatt Earp.
Lost treasures, unsolved murders, disappearances? These stories continue to intrigue lovers of the Old West. Despite today's technology, many of these mysteries remain unsolved. This story begins in the gold mining town of Jacksonville, Oregon. In 1853, brothers James and Henry Wilson set out with a group of prospectors looking for gold. After one of the men was killed by Native Americans, the Wilsons trudged on alone. They eventually found a valley surrounded by steep cliffs and built a cabin. Henry discovered a nearby creek chock full of gold nuggets. With winter on their minds, the boys dug a rock-lined hole in the floor of the cabin, deposited their treasure, and covered it with 2 flat stones. The brothers no sooner set out for civilization when the natives reappeared and killed Henry. James escaped to Northern California. In ill health, he wrote to his cousin Ted Harper about the cabin before dying. 15 years later, Harper and an alcoholic poet, Sam Simpson, went looking for the cabin. All they found were burned ruins with Henry's body inside. Moments later, Harper allegedly accidentally shot himself and died at the same spot as his cousin. A shaken Simpson returned home, sans the gold. Later that year, another group of men went looking for the cabin and missing gold. Of course, they didn't find any gold, but they did discover a national treasure: Crater Lake itself, the deepest known lake in the United States. Modern-day Bigfoot tales aside, the big hairy guy has actually been alive and well since the 16th century, when native tribes reported seeing the Great Sasquatch. Bigfoot stories persist all over the world. In the American West, various newspaper stories from the 1800s were brimming with giant wild men and wood apes, who look and sound like the Bigfoot everyone has come to know and love. Ethnographer George Gibbs started recording native stories of Bigfoot in Oregon as early as 1865, although the first official record of sightings was not made until 1904, when one was seen around Sixes River. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization started recording sightings in each state online in 1995.
Currently, Washington State leads with 690, followed by California with 454, and Florida with 333. Colorado has only 129 recorded sightings, but enough have been reported to merit posting a warning sign on Pikes Peak. In 1540, Spanish explorer Hernando de Alarcón sailed up the Colorado River to what is today known as Yuma, Arizona. But did he make it farther? Some 100 miles southeast around the Salton Sea, folks began reporting a Spanish ship stranded in the California desert. Some speculate that it was possibly a treasure ship that was actually in the Salton Sea when it was stranded by a mudslide. Around 1775, a mule driver for explorer Juan Bautista de Anza said he saw the vessel and even carried away some of the treasured pearls he found aboard. Explorer Albert Evans also claimed to have found the wreck of a gallant ship in 1870. Later that year, Charlie Klusker claimed to have found the galleon, a story backed by Philadelphia's Evening Telegraph. Klusker later disappeared. Others doubt there is a ship, believing that the popular theory that a massive tidal wave stranded the vessel is simply folklore. A man named Lawrence Justus was so convinced the story was true, though, that in 1974, he tried obtaining a permit from Anza Borrego Desert State Park to look for it. Authorities refused the request, but a file at the park contains a picture of Justus, who, quote, reportedly found the lost ship of the desert. On February 3, 1889, the notorious bandit queen, Belle Starr, was murdered by an unknown assailant in Oklahoma. Prior to that time, the one-time good girl had gone through a string of bad men. Outlaws Cole Younger, Jim Reed, Sam Starr, and Jim July, each of whom Belle Starr aided in horse thieving and robbery. She even served time in prison, all while bearing children and living on the lam due to her various escapades. Belle's relationship with July was particularly stormy, to the extent that the man once allegedly offered to pay someone to kill her.
Nobody can give me orders.
That wasn't an order, just a piece of advice. Adios.
Still, Belle remained faithful, accompanying July to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to answer for charges of horse stealing. But then she inexplicably turned back. A dramatic account claims that as she traveled home, Belle was shot in the back over 60 times. More likely, though, she was shot only twice as her horse bolted home and alarmed her daughter, Pearl. Belle was taken home and died an hour later. She was buried in her own front yard. Who killed her? The suspects range from July to a disgruntled neighbor named Watson to Belle's own son Ed, or maybe even Pearl. Of these, only Watson was tried, but he was found not guilty. Albert Jennings Fountain was many things: an Army lieutenant, attorney, newspaperman, and senator. Until his disappearance, he was best known as the trial lawyer for Billy the Kid, who lost his case. In 1896, Fountain and his young son Henry were in Lincoln, New Mexico, for a rustling case against cattle baron Oliver Lee. Fountain had many enemies at the trial, including Lee. No wonder Fountain felt like he was being watched while in Lincoln. And after receiving a threatening note as the trial ended, the Fountains immediately started for home 150 miles away. 2 days later, the pair disappeared. Only Fountain's carriage was found, along with pools of blood, bullet shells, and Henry's handkerchief. Even famed Sheriff Pat Garrett got involved, to no avail. Although Lee's hired hands were eventually tried, they were found not guilty. 2 confessions came later, one by James Gilliland in 1937 and one in 1949 when convicted outlaw Sam Ketchum claimed on his deathbed that it was he and his brother, Tom Blackjack Ketchum, who killed the Fountains. But the bodies weren't where the men said they were. The Fountain case remains the most famous cold case in New Mexico history. Tom Blackjack Ketchum may not have killed Albert and Henry Fountain, but he was certainly found guilty of numerous robberies and murders before he was sentenced to hang in 1901. There are at least 2 stories about Ketchum stashing treasure in the years before he died. The first is that he buried a large treasure in Wildcat Canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains of Arizona. More specifically, writes William Ascarza in his book Chiricahua Mountains, History and Nature, Ketchum stashed several $1,000s in a cave which has been referred to as Room 44. Another historian offers a second story. A posse was chasing Ketchum following a robbery in Camp Verde when the outlaw lassoed himself and some $4,000 in stolen loot to a branch high up in a tree, somewhere around Battleground Ridge. 4 days later, when the coast was clear, Ketchum came down and headed towards Myrtle Ranch, possibly hiding his cash between there and Gilliland Gap. Neither stash has been found, as far as anyone knows. Today, Ketchum is best remembered for his death by hanging in Clayton, New Mexico. When the trap door swung open at the gallows, the outlaw fell further than he should have, yanking his head clean off. History buffs love debating about whether Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid really died in Bolivia. But the real mystery is what became of their companion, Etta Place. Not even Pinkerton's detective agency knew her real name, although they described her as classic good looks, 27 or 28 years old, 5'4" to 5'5" in height, weighing between 110 and 115 pounds, with a medium build and brown hair. But that could be about any woman in the Edwardian era. Everything else about Place is purely speculation. Was she a school teacher, or a harlot from a Texas bordello, or maybe even Sundance's cousin? Nobody knows for sure. It's a fact that Place loved Sundance enough to accompany him and Cassidy to South America. For a couple of glorious years, the trio robbed numerous banks and intercepted one mule train after another, carrying gold and money. Although Place was supposedly killed along with her outlaw men by Bolivian soldiers, others claim that she was later seen back in America, both with and without Sundance. Historian Ann Meadows maintains that Sundance took Place to San Francisco for a final visit in 1905. She was also identified as the woman seeking documents declaring Sundance dead there in 1909. Whoever she was, Place took her secret to her grave. In 1916, the Coco Nino Sun in Flagstaff, Arizona, reported a most chilling find. Alerted by a terrible odor, authorities found the bodies of Madam May Prescott and her husband Fred in a bedroom at their home. Fred's throat was slashed ear to ear. He'd been stabbed in the back and shot in the head. May's throat also was cut, and she had been shot twice. The blood-splattered, bullet-scarred bedroom had been set on fire. Fred also held a gun with one bullet fired and had left a note that he had violently quarreled with May before shooting her and then himself. But how does a man with his throat cut wide open shoot himself in the head and set a fire? For weeks, the coroner pored over tons of evidence. The jury finally concluded that the couple died from, quote, knife and gunshot wounds caused by the hands of unknown party or parties. The case was never solved. Surprisingly, although a portion of the Prescott's home remains under the facade of today's Grand Canyon International Youth Hostel, it is not mentioned on Flagstaff Downtown's list of haunted locations. A true wild child, Pearl Hart was a Canadian native who made it through finishing school before making a series of life mistakes. She was 17 when she was seduced by gambler Fred Hart, who remained in the girl's life until 1898. Tired of supporting her and two children, Fred beat her up and split. The next man in Pearl's life, Joe Boot, was her final undoing. The two embarked on a life of crime, but were caught in 1899. Boot was sentenced to 30 years in prison, though he later escaped while Pearl got 5 years. The public took interest in the woman bandit who dressed like a man. In prison, she not only signed autographs but also began spreading the gospel. Pearl was finally paroled because she inexplicably became pregnant while in prison. Governor Alexander Brody pardoned her in 1902. What happened to her? It's hard to say. Some claim that she tried performing on stage as a lady bandit before being arrested in Kansas City for buying stolen goods. She was arrested again in 1904, after which she wasn't seen again until 1924 in Florence, Arizona. Various sources say she died in 1925, or sometime in the 1950s, or even as late as the 1960s, but nobody knows for sure. Between 1885 and 1886, 8 ghastly murders in Austin, Texas were attributed to a serial killer. Of the victims, most were servant girls, only one survived. But her daughter, as well as the companion of another victim, were killed. 6 of the victims were black. So were 3 women who were attacked in July, August, and November, but mercifully they survived. Then, Molly Smith's axe-mutilated body was found next to an outhouse in December. The murders were quite grisly. In May 1885, another victim, Eliza Shelley, was found with her head almost completely split. The killer was brutal, assaulting his victims with knives, axes, rocks, and even an iron. Locals dubbed the murderer the Servant Girl Annihilator. Shortly after, Irene Cross, Clara Dick, Rebecca, and 11-year-old Mary Ramey were attacked. Only Rebecca survived. The next victims were Gracie Vance and her paramour Orange Washington. Two more women, Sue Hancock and Eula Phillips, were murdered on Christmas Eve, 1885. Serial killers were an unknown phenomenon at the time, so while it seems obvious to us now, authorities at the time thought these killings were actually unrelated.
How could one individual be this savage?
Then, in February 1886, police killed Nathan Elgin, who was beating a saloon girl to death. The attacks abruptly stopped. Though modern historians believe he was likely the killer, Elgin has still never been proven to be the Annihilator. When it opened for business in 1893, the elite Sheridan Inn in Sheridan, Wyoming was so upscale it even offered electricity. Showman Buffalo Bill Cody was on hand at the grand opening and actually purchased the hotel a year later. His selling of the establishment in 1901 coincided with the hiring of Catherine Miss Kate Arnold, just in from her native Virginia. By the 1910 census, Arnold had moved into the inn, where she worked as a seamstress, desk clerk, housekeeper, hostess, and sitter for the many children who stayed at the inn with their families, and she loved her job. During her time at the inn, Arnold met such famous guests as Ernest Hemingway, President Herbert Hoover, Bob Hope, and Will Rogers. Even Annie Oakley stayed there. Amazingly, Arnold remained in the Sheridan's employ until 1965, when the building was to be torn down. But the Sheridan Historical Society was able to save it, and when Arnold died in 1968, she requested her ashes to be interred in the wall of her room 306. Following a small ceremony in the room, her ashes were interred in the wall. The funny thing is, today, nobody seems to know exactly where in the wall the ashes are. One thing is for sure though, guests enjoy staying in the room because her spirit is ever present.
Tombstone, Arizona definitely deserves its wild and woolly reputation, immortalized in history books and pop culture alike. If you want to know more about the town too tough to die, then grab your 6-shooters and get ready for the messed up history of Tombstone.
I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your huckleberry.
It's nearly impossible to think of Tombstone, Arizona without immediately conjuring up images of gunfights and the legendary Earp brothers, but the infamous town had much quieter beginnings. Back in 1877, a silver miner named Ed Shefflin was making his way into the Dragoon Mountains in southeastern Arizona. The local soldiers told Shefflin that he was more likely to find his own tombstone before he located any silver, but the hardy miner proved them wrong. Upon striking a rich vein, Shefflin mockingly named his mine the Tombstone, and by 1879, a town of the same name had sprouted up near Shefflin's diggings. Of course, things quickly took a violent turn. Gamblers, saloon owners, and prostitutes descended upon the fledgling town, and even Shefflin himself must have been surprised that Tombstone grew so quickly. The 1880 census records only 973 people in town, but Tombstone's own website claims there were 4,000 to 5,000 there within a year. The website speculates that if you include less reputable characters, that figure could have been in the tens of thousands. Regardless of exact numbers, the town was growing fast. As a result, Tombstone's population needed their amenities like mercantiles, meat markets, churches, schools, and banks. Naturally, intermixed with such businesses were gambling dens, bawdy houses, and over 100 saloons. The criminal element was alive and well in Tombstone, what with various outlaws and gunfighters wandering into town. In other words, Tombstone was quickly crawling with less than reputable figures. Books, magazines, and movies are rife with stories about the life of Wyatt Earp. After all, he was a prominent figure in the incident at the OK Corral. But even history submits that Wyatt Earp's reputation is mostly myth. The simple facts are these. Earp was born in Illinois to itinerant farmers who moved to Iowa. When his first wife died, a grieving Earp left home and went to Kansas, where he fell into the shady side of life and was frequently in trouble with the law. His assistance in tracking a thief won him a job in Dodge City's police department, and he eventually became marshal. Around this time, he also met his lifelong friend Doc Holliday, as well as his girlfriend, former prostitute Mattie Blaylock. In 1879, Earp and Blaylock lit out for Tombstone, where Earp's brother Virgil was town marshal. Virgil gave Wyatt a job, and soon the Earps were joined by a third brother, Morgan. Legends of America states that with Virgil as marshal and his brothers as special policemen, the Earps became the law of the land in Tombstone. But Wyatt's life became a mess when, in 1880, he cast off Maddie Blaylock in favor of another woman, Sarah Josephine Marcus. A Jewish actress, Josephine was the girlfriend of Sheriff John Behan. Many historians claim that Josephine also was a prostitute with whom Behan had been cavorting for years. Either way, it just goes to show that during Earp's time in Tombstone, he wasn't exactly an upstanding do-gooder. Exactly how did all this go down? Here's the thing about the history of the true story of Tombstone. It's a little murky. Record keeping was, after all, iffy at best, and there wasn't really anyone documenting things as they happened. There was no evening news, so sometimes historians were just left to fill in the gaps as best they can. Born in Georgia, the temperamental John Henry Holliday began his adult life as a trained dentist who unfortunately contracted tuberculosis shortly after hanging out his shingle. According to biography, Holliday turned to playing cards and a love of guns to pass the time. He'd already committed at least one murder, and possibly quite a few more, in Dallas when he met Wyatt Earp, and just where the two first crossed paths is up for debate. Regardless, around this time, he also met the love of his life, a woman named Big Nose Kate. Rumors abound that Kate originally had a fling with Wyatt Earp back in Dodge City prior to her move to Texas. Kate herself denied this, claiming that she met both Earp and Holliday while working as a prostitute and dance hall girl at a local saloon in Fort Griffin. As tempestuous as the relationship was, neither seemed to be able to quit each other. Instead, the couple made do by separating frequently. When the Earps breezed through Prescott, Arizona to convince Holliday to go to Tombstone, Kate went along. According to history, things started to go sideways in March 1881 when Wyatt was out chasing down some stagecoach robbers and ran across Ike Clanton. Clanton knew the robbers and struck a deal with Earp, presumably to turn them in. Then he changed his mind, and the next thing the brothers Earp knew, they were receiving threats from Clanton and his buddies. In the following months, according to Clanton's testimony at least, the Earps and Holliday began harassing Billy Clanton and his friends. On October 26, things came to a head with a 30-second shootout that left Billy Clanton and Tom and Frank McLaury dead. Wyatt and Doc were arrested and a trial was held, then thrown out. Months later, Virgil Earp was wounded and Morgan was murdered as revenge for the shootout.
The American West is a disgusting, awful, dirty, dangerous place. Look around you. Everything out here that's not you wants to kill you.
Today, visitors to Tombstone who visit the reconstructed OK Corral get to watch reenactors blow each other into eternity every single day. What many don't know, however, is that the shootout actually didn't take place in the corral. Instead, it went down on a vacant lot next to a boarding house where Holliday rented a room. That place was on Fremont Street, now known as US Route 80. Today's OK Corral is on Allen Street. So in other words, visitors flocking to the scene of the shootout actually drive right over the original historic spot to get to the fake OK Corral. During the time the Earps and Doc Holliday were in Tombstone, they were active, at the very least by association, in the prostitution industry. Indeed, Wyatt left a trail of wanton women behind him as he traveled. As for Blaylock, she was working as a prostitute herself in the early 1870s. Blaylock was deeply in love with Wyatt, and by 1880, she was identified in the census as his wife. By the time of the OK Corral incident, however, Maddie had developed debilitating migraines and become addicted to laudanum. Earp threw her over for Josephine Marcus, and Maddie died in 1888 of an overdose. James Earp's wife, Bessie, was also a prostitute or madam, hailing from Wichita, Kansas, and she eventually moved with her husband to Tombstone. And even after marrying James in 1873, Bessie continued working as a sporting girl in Kansas. Did Bessie continue sporting once they arrived in Tombstone? No one really knows. And all of that is without even mentioning Big Nose Kate, who was even more notorious, and who had previously worked for Bessie Earp in a brothel in Kansas. Many women made names for themselves in the mining town. According to writer Michelle Floyd, they included such beauties as Dutch Annie and China Mary, who were buried in Boot Hill. These and many other women like them worked out of small rooms known as cribs or dingy brothels where most made little money. More upscale bordellos were also available. According to writer Douglas Town, Tombstone offered an array of bordellos for every man's wallet, from the cribs to fancier parlor houses. The ladies therein paid what were called fines to the city for their licenses to operate. One license is especially interesting because the lady's name on the license is Sadie Jo of the Birdcage Theater. Historians are divided as to whether Sadie Jo was really Earp's lady Sarah Josephine Marcus. But if Sarah and Sadie Jo were one and the same, Earp had everything to gain and nothing to lose by granting her a license for prostitution. For about 2 more decades after the shootout at the OK Corral, Tombstone thrived, but all good things must come to an end. For Tombstone, that happened when the silver mines around town eventually began flooding after they reached a level of 520 feet below the surface. As mines closed, folks moved on. The 1900 census records under 700 people left in town. A 1925 film of the town reveals buildings with shuttered doors and broken windows as a handful of folks wander around the town. But it wouldn't be until the late 1950s that the former courthouse finally opened as a museum. More efforts would come to preserve the town thanks to the work of the Tombstone Restoration Committee. Meanwhile, business owners got to work restoring old businesses and creating viable ways to bring folks back into town in any way they could, including cheesy gimmicks like mechanical gunfighters you could duel with for a quarter. Tombstone might never have dusted its old bones off to rise to glory again if it weren't for Wyatt Earp. The famed lawman spent a number of years wandering around the West before moving to Los Angeles in 1901. Although he had trouble finding someone to publicize his own adventures, according to history, Earp was able to befriend actors like William Hart and Tom Mix. The guys were all ears as Earp embellished his stories about Tombstone. Before long, Earp was a Wild West hero and a welcome sight on LA movie sets as a consultant, the man who knew what really happened on the streets of Tombstone. Earp died in 1929, but in the wake of his funeral, dozens and dozens of westerns would come out in the years that followed. Famous actors like Henry Fonda, Burt Lancaster, and James Garner have all played Earp, while Hollywood legends like Victor Mature, Kirk Douglas, and Jason Robards have taken on the mantle of Doc Holliday. In more modern cinema, we've seen actors like Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer taking on the roles of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, doing what they do best at the OK Corral. And it just goes to show that some stories, even if you've heard them before, still capture the imagination. Tombstone's Chamber of Commerce points out that the Tombstone of today has been a National Historic Landmark District since 1962, a Preserve America community since 2009, and most importantly, it's a real community, lest anyone come in there in hopes of relieving historic properties of their treasures. Also, metal detecting and treasure hunting is officially off limits. Now a bona fide town of the tourist trade, Tombstone continues to be a film-friendly community, where filmmakers are welcome to set up their cameras and tell their own story about what really happened way back when, so long as one procures the proper permits. As for sights to see, reviewers tend to describe it more along the lines of an ultra-commercialized version of the Wild West than a museum-quality, well-preserved pocket of history. But fortunately, reviewers on TripAdvisor do highly recommend the actual museums to see the real history. But if you're looking for tacky stores, there are plenty, with names like Desert Eagle Trading Post, Fallen Angel Sweet Sin Parlor, and the Shady Lady's Closet. Fortunately, it seems that the people of Tombstone are incredibly friendly, unlike their gunfighting ancestors.
There were various men in the American Southwest who went by the moniker Billy the Kid. However, the one that most people think of was variously known as Henry McCarty, Henry Antrim, Kid Antrim, William H. Bonney, Billy Bonney, and sometimes just the Kid. He was a soldier in range wars, a cattle rustler, a horse thief, but he was also universally described as charming, funny, a good singer and good dancer, at least bilingual, and an avid reader.
How's a good-looking kid? Way with the women? Dresses like a dandy and he's a left-hander. And people say he's fond of whistling sad ballads.
Even by frontier standards, he was young. He was high-spirited, and as his notoriety grew, so did his cockiness. And yet, with the good cheer came a surprising ruthlessness. Though quick with a joke, he did not hesitate before pulling the trigger. According to Robert M. Utley's definitive Billy the Kid, by the time his life ended on July 14, 1881, at age 21, Billy had killed 4 men for certain, 1 perhaps, and participated in killing perhaps 5 more. He was a wanted young man. For deaths, sure. For horse theft, of course, but mostly because of the cattle that went missing. Meanwhile, Pat Garrett was a man of the times. 9 years older than Billy, he'd been a buffalo hunter, hired gun, and cowboy before he ran for sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico, on a law and order platform. He was appointed deputy sheriff for the last 2 months of 1880 before taking office in January 1st, 1881. At the same time, he served as a deputy U.S. Marshal. The 2 men knew each other and had socialized with one another, although it might be a stretch to call them friends. Billy's arrest found him in Garrett's custody. Garrett was well aware that Billy was a cockeyed optimist when it came to hopes for escape. Garrett would later write in his own autobiography of Billy, "I knew the desperate character of the man, that he was daring and unscrupulous, and that he would sacrifice the lives of 100 men who stood between him and liberty." As they talked, Garrett said that, "Billy expressed no enmity towards me, but he evinced respect and confidence in me, acknowledging that I had only done my duty without malice and treated him with marked leniency and kindness." Garrett was correct in his estimation of the kid. Billy was a legendary man who had managed to escape incarceration more than once, and that included his last escape from the custody of Sheriff Garrett. On his way to freedom, charming Billy killed 2 of his jailers. After the escape, Garrett set out to remove Billy from the landscape one way or another. Garrett learned that the kid had been in and out of Sumner, New Mexico, and was staying there with Pete Maxwell. On the evening of July 14th, Garrett waited inside Maxwell's bedroom. In the dark, Billy had gone to cut a slice of meat. Returning to the building with pistol in one hand, knife in the other, Billy was startled and instead of opening fire, hesitated, repeatedly asking in Spanish, "Who is it?" Garrett fired twice, hitting Billy once and killing him. Garrett went on to be a rancher, customs collector, sheriff of another county, and terrible gambler. He was plagued by debt in his later years, and while his ranch holdings weren't anywhere near profitable, their locations were desirable for water rights and staging grounds for, shall we say, nefarious activities. His end wasn't particularly glamorous. He had stopped his wagon on a lonely road about 4 miles east of Las Cruces, New Mexico, in order to empty his bladder. In the midst of the act, he was shot in the back of the head. He was 57. A man named Wayne Brazel confessed to the killing of Garrett, but a later trial cleared him of any wrongdoing. The lack of an in-depth investigation has led to many conspiracy theories surrounding Garrett's death, although the truth of the matter will likely never be known. Regardless, even the man who shot charming, murderous Billy the Kid deserved a better end than a bullet while watering the desert.
There's a lot of myths about the Old West out there in the wild, and we're here to run them down, tie them up, and leave them on the train tracks. Here are some false facts about the Wild West you always thought were true, pardner. Not so savage natives. You'd be forgiven for thinking that those who settled the untamed American West lived in constant fear of Native Americans. Just pop in any famous Western, sit back, and watch the arrows fly. The truth is, however, that the Native Americans weren't as hostile to those covered wagon travelers as most people believe. While some violent altercations naturally took place, convoys of covered wagons rarely came under attack. Only stragglers ran any real risk, as lone wagons or small groups represented much easier pickings. In reality, many friendly tribes saw groups of settlers as prime trade opportunities. Ultimately, the threat from Indian attack was minimal at best. Along the busiest trails west, Native Americans killed, on record, 362 emigrants between 1840 and 1860. Pair that to the upward of 30,000 total emigrants who died from all causes during the same 20-year span. Truth be told, more Native Americans died at the hands of settlers in that span than vice versa, at 426 total recorded deaths. All that glitters. Everyone thinks California hosted America's first gold rush in 1849, and for good reason. There's the San Francisco 49ers, plus it's even nicknamed the Golden State. But that nugget of wisdom is fool's gold. California wasn't home to the first gold rush, it wasn't even the second. 50 years before some gold nuggets at a California mill triggered the largest mass migration in U.S. history, a 17-pound chunk of the precious metal was discovered in North Carolina, leading to a flood of more than 30,000 prospectors to the Tar Heel State. The great state of Georgia holds claim to America's second gold rush in 1829. The Georgia Journal printed the following notice in August. Cue the music!
Gold! A gentleman of the first respectability in Havisham County writes us thus. 2 gold mines have just been discovered in this county, and preparations are making to bring these hidden treasures of the earth to use.
Only a few months later, northern Georgia was overrun by those hopeful of striking it rich. 20 years before California and its famous 49ers. White lie. The stereotypical image of cowboys as a white, distinctly American invention is just plain false. The deepest roots of the popular cowboy date back to the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico. As ranches spread across modern-day Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, so too did trained ranchers, called vaqueros, who earned the title of America's first cowboys. And while decades of film and television have conditioned us to incorrectly think that most cowboys at the time were white, 1 in 4 19th century cowboys in the state of Texas, for example, were black. And even more were Mexican, making white cowboys in the state a minority. Sorry to break it to you, Mongo, but the prevalence of your people is kind of historically inaccurate. Don't bank on it. According to popular belief, it would have been safer to keep your money buried under a cactus in the Old West than in a bank, which was robbed by roving bandits on an almost daily basis. In reality, banks at the time were very safe spaces to keep your valuables, perhaps even safer than banks today. According to the Foundation for Economic Freedom, there were fewer than 10 confirmed bank robberies total from 1859 to 1900. That's one heist every 4 years, on average. hardly an epidemic. In 1974, one historian even claimed the Old West was a far more civilized, more peaceful, and safer place than American society today, as violence and theft was not so culturally ingrained as popular history leads us to believe. Jumping the gun. According to almost every Western ever, the average town had more guns than a well-stocked Walmart in Tennessee. Would you believe that the Old West had stricter gun laws than many states today? It's true. Property owners and ranchers all over called for tight restrictions on firearms with the knowledge that more guns, in the wrong hands, meant more problems.
You want that gun, pick it up. I wish you would.
In fact, frontier towns, places like Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge, had the most restrictive gun control laws in the nation. Laws that would make 21st century Second Amendment advocates weep. In many places, cowboys weren't even allowed to carry guns, as they were told that carrying around a six-shooter was not a necessary part of their job. The Kansas newspaper, the Caldwell Commercial, called revolvers a relic of barbarism. Them's fighting words!